June 1st, 1899. The rain fell not in drops but in sheets, a relentless driving deluge that turned the high Wyoming plains into a slurry of gray mud and standing water. Masked men sat on their horses amidst the sagebrush and the gloom, motionless figures wrapped in yellow oilskin slickers that gleamed wetly in the faint diffused light of a sun completely choked by thick turbulent storm clouds. They were positioned just north of the Union Pacific tracks, near a lonely, desolate siding known as Wilcox, miles from the nearest semblance of civilization. The water ran off the brims of their hats in constant rivulets, soaking into the leather of their reins and darkening the heavy wool of their trousers where the slickers failed to cover. It was a cold rain, typical for early June in this high altitude, a biting chill that seeped through layers of clothing and settled deep in the bone. The horses shifted their weight uncomfortably, hooves making sucking sounds as they lifted and replanted in the sodden earth, their ears flattened against the driving wind that swept down from the Laramie Mountains to the south. Harvey Logan, known to lawmen and associates alike as Kid Curry, wiped a gloved hand across his face, smearing water and grit but clearing his eyes for a moment. He stared at the steel rails of the Union Pacific line, two parallel streaks of wet iron disappearing into the misty gray horizon in both directions. The tracks were the lifeline of the West, the conduit for mail, passengers, and most importantly to the men waiting in the storm, large shipments of currency and gold moving from the West Coast to the banks in the East. Logan checked the action of his Winchester rifle, shielding the mechanism with his body to keep the water out of the receiver. The metal was cold and slick to the touch. He verified a round was chambered, the brass cartridge gleaming dully before he snapped the lever back into place. Beside him, Harry Longabaugh, the man they called the Sundance Kid, adjusted the bandana around his neck, trying to keep the water from running down his spine. The third man, flat-nosed George Curry, sat hunched forward in his saddle, watching the telegraph wires that ran alongside the tracks, the thin copper lines humming audibly in the wind. The location they had chosen was specific and tactical. Wilcox was barely a place, merely a name on a railroad map, a milepost designation in the emptiness of Albany County. The terrain here was open but broken by ravines and gullies that offered escape routes to the north, toward the jagged relief of the Casper Mountains and eventually the Powder River country. It was land that favored the rider who knew it and punished the pursuer who did not. The isolation was their primary weapon. Here 60 miles northwest of Laramie and roughly 50 miles from Rawlins, help for the railroad crew would be hours away, assuming the telegraph wires remained intact long enough for a distress signal to go out. The men had arrived hours earlier to survey the ground, ensuring that the heavy rains had not washed out the gulch they intended to use for their retreat. The mud was deep, a thick gumbo that clung to boots and hooves, but the bottom of the ravine was rocky enough to support the weight of galloping horses if they kept their speed manageable. Longabaugh dismounted, his boots sinking 2 inches into the muck. He moved to the saddlebags on his horse, unbuckling the leather flap with stiff, cold fingers. Inside, wrapped in layers of waxed canvas and wool, were the tools of their trade. He extracted 2 signal lanterns, standard railroad issue, one with a clear lens and one with a red lens. He handled them with extreme care, checking the oil reservoirs to ensure they were full. Lighting a lantern in this gale would be a task requiring patience and a steady hand. He shielded the first lantern with his slicker, striking a lucifer match on the dry underside of his belt buckle. The flame flared, sputtered in the damp air, and then caught the wick. He lowered the glass globe quickly, trapping the flame before the wind could snuff it out. The yellow glow illuminated the falling rain, creating a small sphere of light in the overwhelming gray. He repeated the process for the second lantern, the red one, which would serve as the primary signal to stop the train. George Curry watched Longabaugh work, his eyes scanning the surrounding brush for any sign of movement. While the likelihood of a random rider passing through this desolate stretch in such foul weather was low, the gang operated on a principle of absolute caution. A sheep herder or a stray cowboy could ruin the entire operation with a single word in the right ear. The only sound was the wind hissing through the sage and the rhythmic drumming of rain on their hats. The silence of the plains was heavy, amplified by the storm. They were waiting for the Overland Flyer, the Union Pacific's premier express train. It was scheduled to pass through this section of track sometime after midnight, technically pushing the event into the early hours of June 2nd. They had hours yet to wait. The waiting was always the hardest part, a test of nerves and endurance where the mind could wander to the possibility of failure, of prison, or of a shallow grave in the mud. Logan dismounted as well, needing to keep the blood flowing in his legs. He walked to the tracks, his spurs jingling softly, a sound instantly swallowed by the storm. He inspected the wooden ties, black with creosote and rain. He looked at the trestle bridge a short distance to the west. That bridge was a key element of their plan. It spanned a swollen creek, a tributary fed by the runoff from the high country. The water beneath the wooden structure was churning, brown and violent. If they could stop the train before the bridge, they could control the movement of the crew. If they could stop it across the bridge, they could isolate the engine and the express car from the passenger coaches, creating a physical barrier between the money and any potential resistance from the civilians or guards in the rear cars. It was a strategy born of experience, a mechanical separation of the target from the herd. Logan kicked at a loose spike near the rail, verifying the integrity of the track. They did not want to derail the train. A wreck destroyed the prize and brought unwanted complications. They needed the train intact and stationary. The men regrouped near the horses, sharing a canteen of water that tasted of tin. They did not speak much. Words were unnecessary when the plan had been rehearsed and refined in the camps at Hole in the Wall and Robber's Roost. Each man knew his role. Logan was the enforcer, the man who would handle the engineer and the fireman. Longabaugh was the cover, his eyes sharp, his aim true, watching for anyone popping a head out of a window with a rifle. George Curry would manage the horses, keeping them calm and ready for the explosive violence that would inevitably shatter the night. They checked their revolvers again. Logan carried Colt single-action Army revolvers, .45 caliber, the grips worn smooth from use. He spun the cylinder of the right-hand gun, checking the primers of the cartridges. Moisture was the enemy of gunpowder. A wet cartridge was a dud, and a dud could mean death. He wiped the gun down with a dry rag taken from inside his coat, drying the hammer and the trigger guard. As the afternoon wore on and darkened into evening, the temperature dropped further. The rain turned to a cold drizzle, then back to a hard, driving storm. The sky was a bruised purple in the west, fading to absolute black as the sun set behind the cloud cover. They moved the horses into a small depression behind a cluster of boulders to give the animals some respite from the wind. The animals stood with heads low, miserable but resigned. The men ate strips of dried beef, chewing, slowly their eyes adjusting to the deepening darkness. The only light came from the 2 lanterns sitting on the ground, sheltered by a rock, and the occasional jagged streak of lightning that illuminated the vast, empty prairie for a split second, revealing the glistening rails and the swaying sagebrush before plunging everything back into obscurity. Around 10 o'clock at night, the wind shifted slightly, coming more from the north. It brought the smell of ozone and wet earth. Logan checked the dynamite charges stored in his saddlebags. They had brought enough explosives to open a bank vault, let alone a rail car. Sticks of giant powder were wrapped in oilcloth, bundled together with fuses already cut to length. Dynamite was stable enough, but it could be unpredictable if the nitroglycerin began to sweat or if the caps were mishandled. He treated the bundles with the reverence due a sleeping rattlesnake. They had also brought sledgehammers and chisels, simpler tools for simpler obstacles, but the dynamite was the key to the safe. The express cars on the Union Pacific were reinforced, built to withstand exactly this kind of assault. The safes inside were heavy steel, requiring brute force to breach. The two men moved closer to the tracks as midnight approached. They could hear the faint rhythmic chugging of a freight train passing in the opposite direction, heading west. They crouched in the brush, watching the headlight of the locomotive cut a cone of light through the rain. The freight train rumbled past, a long line of boxcars clattering over the joints in the rails. The ground shook with the weight of the tonnage. Sparks flew from the wheels as the flanges bit into the curves. The caboose passed, its red marker lights fading into the distance. It was a reminder of the power and scale of the railroad. These machines were behemoths of iron and steam, unstoppable by anything less than a mountain or a missing rail. The men waited until the sound of the freight train had completely faded before moving to their positions. Longabaugh took the lanterns. He would be the signalman. He walked down the track to the east, positioning himself where the engineer of the approaching flyer would see the light in time to brake. He needed to be far enough away from the stopping point to allow for the train's momentum to carry it to the desired spot, but close enough that the crew wouldn't have time to think or react defensively. It was a calculus of distance and speed. He set the white lantern down and held the red one ready, the crimson glass dark for now, waiting for the cover of the shutter to be lifted. Logan and Curry positioned themselves on the north side of the tracks, hidden in the tall grass and the shadows of the siding's embankment. They tied their horses securely to the brush. A spooked horse running off with their escape gear would be a disaster. The waiting resumed. The rain intensified again, a cold, soaking punishment. Logan adjusted his hat, pulling it lower. His breathing was steady, his heart rate controlled. This was the profession he had chosen. A life of hard riding, cold nights, and moments of supreme adrenaline. There was no romance in the mud and the freezing rain, only the grim reality of the job. He thought about the interior of the express car, the dry, warm space where the clerk sat guarding the company's assets. That clerk was the only variable they could not fully predict. Would he open the door? Would he fight? Would he have a shotgun leveled at the entrance? Logan prepared himself for any reaction. Violence was a tool, to be applied with precision when necessary, and with overwhelming force when resistance was offered. 1 o'clock in the morning came and went. The storm showed no sign of breaking. The ground was now a quagmire. The men stamped their feet quietly to keep the feeling in their toes. The cold was numbing. Making fingers stiff and clumsy, they flexed their hands, working the muscles, ensuring they would be ready to grip a pistol or a rifle stock. Every sound in the night was analyzed, the howl of a coyote, the snap of a branch, the rumble of thunder. They were predators listening for the approach of a larger beast. The telegraph wires overhead continued their song, carrying messages between cities, unaware that the line would soon be severed. The Union Pacific Overland Flyer was running late, delayed by the weather and the slick rails. The men knew the schedule was merely a suggestion in a storm like this. They had to be patient. To leave now would be to abandon the prize. To stay was to risk exposure, but the reward outweighed the risk. The rumor was that this train carried a significant shipment of unsigned banknotes, fresh from the Treasury, destined for banks in the Pacific Northwest. Paper money was lighter than gold and easier to carry, though harder to spend if the numbers were recorded. But unsigned notes were as good as gold, untraceable once signed. It was a fortune waiting to be taken, sitting in a safe moving at 40 miles per hour toward them. Around 1:30 in the morning, a faint vibration began in the rails. Logan felt it through the soles leading of his boots before he heard it. He placed a hand on the wet steel of the track. A low hum, steady and growing. He signaled to the others it was time. The vibration grew into a sound, a distant rhythmic exhaust beat. Chuff, chuff, chuff. The whistle blew for a crossing miles away, a lonely, mournful shriek carried on the wind. Then the light appeared. A pinprick of white in the east, growing larger and brighter with every second. The headlight of the #1 flyer cut through the rain, illuminating the falling drops like millions of diamonds. Longabaugh stepped up onto the ties, the red lantern in his hand. He checked the wick one last time. It was burning bright. He stood in the center of the track, a solitary figure against the onrushing steel giant. He began to swing the lantern back and forth, the universal railroad signal for stop. The red arc swung left, then right, cutting a bloody swath through the darkness. The train was closing fast, the noise of the engine becoming a roar that drowned out the wind. The ground trembled violently. Logan and Curry watched from the weeds, their rifles raised. They watched the cab of the locomotive. They saw the silhouette of the engineer leaning out the window, trying to see through the rain. They saw the sudden venting of steam as the brakes were applied. The screech of metal on metal tore through the night, sparks showering from the wheels as the brake shoes clamped down on the wet iron. The train was slowing, fighting its own momentum, sliding on the slick rails. The massive drive wheels locked and skidded, then turned slowly again as the engineer fought to bring the beast to a halt. The train loomed over Longabaugh, a tower of black iron and hissing steam. The heat radiating from the boiler hit him, a sudden wave of warmth in the freezing night. The cowcatcher stopped just yards from where he stood. The headlight blinded him, casting his long shadow back down the tracks toward the bridge. The train hissed and groaned, settling on its springs. The noise of the steam release was deafening. The flyer had stopped. Logan and Curry rose from the grass, their slickers shedding water. They moved instantly, not running but moving with a swift, predatory purpose toward the locomotive cab. The waiting was over. The cold, the rain, and the misery of the last 12 hours were forgotten. Now there was only the train, the crew, and the safe. The silence of the plains was gone, replaced by the mechanical breathing of the engine and the shouting of men. The first phase of the robbery at Wilcox had begun. The massive drive wheels of the Union Pacific locomotive ground to a halt on the wet iron rails, the friction sending a shudder through the entire length of the train that rattled the teeth of everyone on board. Steam hissed violently from the cylinder cocks, creating a deafening white cloud that wrapped around the front of the engine, obscuring the view of the dark prairie beyond. The heat radiating from the boiler was intense, warring with the frigid downpour that continued to hammer the metal skin of the machine. Inside the cab, Engineer W.R. Jones stood with his hand still gripping the brass brake lever, his knuckles white from the tension of the emergency stop. He peered out through the small, rain-streaked window, trying to make sense of the red signal lantern that had swung so wildly in the darkness just moments before. Beside him, the fireman, a man named Dietrich, leaned on his shovel, his face smeared with coal dust and sweat, eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning fear. The sudden silence of the pistons, usually a rhythmic heartbeat for the crew, was replaced by the aggressive venting of excess pressure and the drumming of the storm. Before either railroad man could speak a word of inquiry, the heavy iron footsteps on the gangway signaled an arrival. Two figures materialized from the steam and rain, pulling themselves up the slick metal stairs of the tender with practiced agility. Jones turned, ready to shout at what he assumed were track walkers or a stranded crew. But the words died in his throat. A black bore of a .45 caliber Colt revolver was leveled directly at his face. Behind the barrel, the grim, wet face of Harvey Logan stared back, water dripping from the brim of his hat onto the yellow oilskin slicker that bulked out his frame. Behind Logan, the second man, George Curry, swung his own weapon toward Dietrich. the hammer already cocked back with a distinct metallic click that was audible even over the hissing steam. The intrusion was sudden, violent, and absolute. The sanctuary of the locomotive cab, usually a place of technical mastery and routine, had been instantly transformed into a cage. Logan stepped fully into the cab, the water from his slicker pooling on the iron floorboards mixed with the coal dust and grease. He did not yell. His voice was low, flat, and carried a menace far more effective than a scream. He ordered the men to raise their hands. Jones released the brake lever slowly, lifting his hands to shoulder height, his palms facing outward to show he held no weapon. Dietrich dropped his shovel, the metal clang against the floor ringing sharply in the confined space. The outlaws moved with a professional efficiency, checking the waists of the crew for hidden firearms. Finding none, Logan kept his aim steady on the engineer while Curry moved to the rear of the cab to watch the tender and the track behind them. The heat from the firebox was stifling the orange glow from the grate, illuminating the outlaws' eyes, making them look like specters from the underworld. Back in the passenger coaches, the sudden stop had jolted the travelers awake. Necks snapped forward, luggage tumbled from overhead racks, and a murmur of confusion began to ripple through the cars. Conductor Brooks, a man responsible for the safety and schedule of the train, grabbed his lantern and buttoned his uniform jacket against the cold. He assumed the train had blown a cylinder head or encountered a washout. He stepped out of the rear vestibule of the first passenger coach, his boots crunching on the wet ballast rock. He swung his lantern, casting a beam of yellow light into the driving rain, and began to walk briskly toward the engine to assess the trouble. The rain lashed at his face, stinging his skin, but he lowered his head and pushed forward, focused on his duty. He could see the steam venting up ahead and the dark shapes of men moving in the cab. As Brooks approached the tender, shouting out to Jones to ask the reason for the delay, a shot rang out. The report of the heavy-caliber rifle cracked through the storm, a sharp, flat sound that had no echo on the open plain. A projectile tore into the gravel just inches from Brooks's left boot, kicking up a spray of wet rock and mud. He froze, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand. From the shadows of the trackside brush where Harry Longabaugh still stood guard, a voice commanded him to go back. The order was simple and profane. The voice promised that the next shot would not miss. Brooks, realizing the gravity of the situation instantly, did not argue. He extinguished his lantern to stop making himself a target and retreated rapidly back toward the passenger cars to warn the brakemen and porters to lock the doors and keep the passengers down. The train was under siege. Inside the cab, Logan watched the conductor retreat through the side window. He turned his attention back to Jones. The engineer was trembling, slightly, not from cold but from the adrenaline dumping into his system. Logan stepped closer, the muzzle of his revolver pressing explicitly against the engineer's ribs. The outlaw demanded to know the composition of the train. He wanted to know which car was the express car and if there were guards posted in the vestibules. Jones, understanding that his life hung by a thread, answered quickly. The express car was directly behind the tender. The mail car was behind that. He claimed he did not know about guards, as that was not his department. Logan struck him across the face with the back of his free hand, a sharp, stinging blow that split the engineer's lip. The outlaw told him not to play games. The violence was a calibration, a way to establish dominance and ensure immediate, unquestioning obedience. Curry moved to the connection between the tender and the express car. He looked at the heavy door of the express car. It was shut tight, locked from the inside. This was the fortress they needed to breach. Inside that car, Express Messenger E.C. Woodcock was listening. He had felt the train stop, heard the shot and heard the shouting. He knew exactly what was happening. He extinguished the lamps inside the car, plunging himself into darkness, and checked the lock on the heavy safe. He crouched behind a stack of crates, gripping his own revolver, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew the protocol. Under no circumstances was he to open the door. The company relied on the integrity of that door and the courage of the messenger. Back in the locomotive, the environment was a sensory overload of tension. The smell of burning coal and hot oil mixed with the metallic scent of the rain and the wet wool of the bandits' clothing. The pressure gauge on the boiler was rising slowly as the engine sat idle, the steam building up with nowhere to go. Dietrich the fireman glanced at the water glass, worried about the boiler level, but he dared not move to the injector. Without permission, Curry noticed the glance and gestured with his chin for the fireman to do his job. They needed the engine live and functional, not blown up by a dry boiler. Dietrich moved slowly, turning the valve, and the rush of water into the boiler created a loud, gurgling sound that briefly masked the wind. Logan leaned out of the cab window, looking back down the length of the train. He could see the darkened windows of the passenger cars. He knew that soon someone might try to be a hero. A hidden rifleman in a passenger window, a marshal traveling in disguise, these were the variables that killed bank robbers. He needed to alter the battlefield. The current position was too exposed. The passenger cars were too close to the engine. If a firefight broke out, the bandits would be caught between the crew in the cab and the armed men potentially in the coaches. They needed to separate the head from the body. The plan required the trestle bridge they had scouted earlier, the one located a short distance to the west of their current position. Logan turned to Jones and gave a new set of orders. He instructed the engineer to prepare to move the train forward. Jones looked at him, confused. The signal was red. The track was blocked by the lantern. Logan pistol-whipped the engineer, the heavy steel barrel striking the man's shoulder with a sickening thud. He told Jones to ignore the signal and do as he was told. Jones gasped in pain, clutching his shoulder, but nodded. He reached for the reverser bar, unlatching it and shoving it forward. He released the air brakes, the hiss of the escaping air signaling the release of the wheels. He cracked the throttle. The locomotive shuddered as steam entered the cylinders. The drive wheels slipped on the wet rails, spinning uselessly for a second before catching traction. The train groaned and began to creep forward. Longabaugh, seeing the movement, scrambled up from the tracks and boarded the engine from the fireman's side, joining his partners in the cab. Now there were 3 outlaws and 2 crewmen crammed into the small, hot space. Longabaugh reported that the rear of the train was quiet for now, but they needed to hurry. The conductor had been spooked, but he would be organizing a defense soon. The train moved slowly through the rain, the headlight cutting a beam through the darkness. Logan watched the track ahead, looking for the bridge. He needed Jones to stop the train exactly where he wanted it. It was a precision maneuver performed at gunpoint. The engineer was operating purely on instinct now, his hands moving over the controls while his mind raced with terror. He could feel the eyes of the bandits on his back. He knew that one wrong move, one sudden jerk of the throttle, and he would be dead before he hit the floor. As the train rolled forward, the bandits forced Dietrich to climb over the coal pile in the tender to the rear. They wanted him to uncouple the train, but not yet. First, they had to position it. The rain was coming down harder now, a torrential flood that made visibility almost zero. The telegraph poles flashed by in the periphery, ghostly markers of their progress. The noise of the engine working, the chug-chug-chug of the exhaust, was louder now, echoing off the low hills. Inside the express car, Woodcock felt the train moving again. This confused him. Had the robbers given up? Was the engineer trying to make a run for it? He stayed hidden, gripping his weapon. He did not know that he was being transported to a slaughtering ground. He hoped that the train would pick up speed, that they would race through the night to the next station where help waited. But the train did not accelerate. It kept a slow walking pace, a funeral march of iron and steam. In the cab, the heat was becoming unbearable for the outlaws in their heavy slickers, but they did not remove them. The coats concealed their extra ammunition and the sticks of dynamite they carried. Logan wiped sweat from his eyes. He kept his gun trained on Jones. He asked the engineer how far to the trestle. Jones stammered that it was less than a mile. Logan nodded. That was good. He told Jones to watch for the creek. When the engine crossed the bridge, he was to stop. Not before, not after. The engine and the tender and the first car had to be across. The rest of the train had to be on the other side. The tension in the cab was palpable. It was a clash of wills and a physical ordeal. The outlaws were calm, focused, their violence controlled and purposeful. The crewmen were shattered, their routine destroyed, their safety stripped away. Jones tried to focus on the rails. He saw the gleam of water ahead. The creek was swollen, rushing under the tracks. The wooden timbers of the trestle bridge appeared in the headlights' beam, wet and black. He eased off the throttle. He applied the air brake gently. He did not want to skid. He guided the massive locomotive onto the bridge. The sound of the wheels changed from a solid rumble to a hollow roar as they moved over the open span. Logan watched the ground passing below. He waited until the tender cleared the far side of the bridge. He waited until the express car was fully across. Then he shouted to stop. Jones slammed the brakes. The train bucked and halted. The locomotive, tender, and express car were now on the solid ground west of the creek. The rest of the train, the mail car and the passenger coaches, stretched back across the bridge and onto the eastern bank. The trap was set. The bandits ordered Jones and Dietrich down from the cab. They moved out into the rain again. The transition from the furnace heat of the engine to the freezing storm was a physical shock. They stood on the muddy embankment. Logan ordered Dietrich to grab a sledgehammer from the toolbox on the tender. He told Jones to grab a coal pick. The men obeyed, their hands shaking. The outlaws led them back toward the coupling between the express car and the rest of the train. They reached the gap between the cars. The coupler was under tension. The rain poured down on them. Logan pointed to the pin that connected the express car to the mail car behind it. He ordered Dietrich to pull the pin. The fireman struggled. The weight of the train was pulling against the coupling. He hammered on the pin with the sledgehammer, metal clanging against metal. It wouldn't budge. Curry stepped forward, shoving the fireman aside. He examined the coupling. The train was stretched tight. They needed slack. Logan shouted up to Jones, who was still in the cab. He ordered him to reverse the engine slightly to release the tension. Jones, terrified, climbed back into the cab. He moved the reverser. He nudged the throttle. The engine hissed and moved backward an inch. The coupling groaned and went slack. Curry reached in and yanked the pin free. The air hoses parted with a sharp hiss. The train was now severed. The head was free from the body. The bandits ordered Jones to pull the engine and the express car forward again just a few yards, to put distance between them and the stranded passenger cars. Jones complied. The gap widened. 10 feet, 20 feet, 50 feet. Now a stretch of wet track and the dark, rushing water of the creek separated the robbers and their prize from the hundreds of passengers and the conductor. The bridge was now a no-man's land. Logan, Curry, and Longabaugh stood by the express car. They had the safe. They had the tools. And they had the crew as hostages. The wind howled around them, whipping their coats. They turned their attention to the sealed door of the express car. The time for stealth and maneuvering was over. The time for brute force had arrived. Logan walked up to the door and hammered on it with the butt of his revolver. He shouted for the messenger to open up. Inside, silence was the only answer. Woodcock was not going to make this easy. The outlaws exchanged glances. They had expected this. It was part of the dance. If the messenger wouldn't open the door for a polite request, he would open it for something much more persuasive. Logan reached into his saddlebag, which he had slung over his shoulder before boarding, and pulled out a bundle of dynamite. The fuse was dry, protected by the oilcloth. He looked at the door, then at the terrified fireman standing in the mud. He handed the dynamite to Dietrich. He told the fireman to place the charge on the door sill. Dietrich's eyes went wide with horror. He tried to back away, shaking his head. Curry cocked his pistol again and stepped close, the muzzle pressing into the fireman's neck. He gave him a choice: carry the explosives or die right there in the mud. Dietrich took the bundle. His hands were so slick with rain and sweat he almost dropped it. He walked to the express car door, his legs feeling like water, and wedged the dynamite against the wood. This was the reality of the night. There were no heroes here, only men with guns and men without them. The rain washed over the scene, cleaning nothing, only adding to the misery and the slick, treacherous nature of the ground. The red signal light was far behind them now, a forgotten warning in the dark. Here by the bridge, the only light was the headlight of the severed engine, casting a long, bright beam into the empty Wyoming wilderness, illuminating nothing but sagebrush and the falling rain. The steel rails shone wetly, waiting for the violence that was about to unfold. The bandits stepped back, seeking cover behind the tender. Logan struck a match, shielding it carefully. The flame flared. He looked at the fuse. It was time to knock. June 2nd, 1899. The rain continued its vertical assault on the Wyoming landscape, turning the ground around the isolated locomotive into a churned slurry of black mud and slick clay. With the train successfully divided, the engine and express car sat alone on the western bank of the swollen creek, physically divorced from the string of passenger coaches that remained stranded on the eastern side of the wooden trestle. The gap between the two sections of the train was a chasm of dark, rushing water and rain-slicked timber, a tactical void created to ensure the outlaws could operate without interference. Harvey Logan stood near the tender, water streaming from the brim of his hat, surveying the work. The separation was complete, but the isolation was not yet absolute. Above them, strung between wet wooden poles that paralleled the tracks, the copper telegraph wires hummed in the wind. Those thin metallic threads were the only connection the crew had to the outside world, to the dispatchers in Laramie and the lawmen in Cheyenne. As long as those wires remained intact, a signal could be tapped out from the passenger cars or a portable key, alerting the entire railroad network to the crime in progress. Logan turned his attention to the telegraph pole nearest the halted engine. He signaled to George Curry, gesturing with the barrel of his revolver toward the wires overhead. The wind was whipping the lines back and forth, making them difficult targets for gunfire in the darkness. To shoot the wires would require a waste of ammunition they might need later, and there was no guarantee a bullet would sever the copper cleanly. They needed a more direct method. Logan turned to the fireman, Dietrich, who was shivering uncontrollably in the mud near the express car. The fireman's face was pale, streaked with coal dust that had turned into a black paste in the rain. Logan barked an order, his voice barely audible over the roar of the steam venting from the engine. He commanded Dietrich to climb the pole and cut the wires. Dietrich looked at the pole. It was a rough-hewn timber, slick with creosote and rain, rising 20 feet into the stormy sky. He looked at his hands, which were shaking and numb from the cold. He tried to protest, stammering that he had no climbers, no belt, and no pliers. Logan did not tolerate the hesitation. He stepped forward, grabbing the fireman by the collar of his sodden jacket and shoving him roughly toward the base of the pole. He told the man that he would find a way to climb, or he would be left in the mud with a hole in his head. The threat was not a bluff. The flat, dead look in the outlaw's eyes promised violence. Curry produced a heavy knife from his belt, a blade used for camp chores and skinning game, and pressed the handle into Dietrich's trembling hand. The fireman gripped the wood of the pole, his boots slipping on the wet surface. He wrapped his arms around the circumference, pressing his cheek against the splinters, and began the agonizing ascent. Every inch was a struggle against gravity and friction. The rain blinded him, running into his eyes and mouth. Below him, the three outlaws watched, their weapons trained on his back. Jones, the engineer, stood by the track, watching his partner struggle, helpless to intervene. The sound of Dietrich's boots scraping against the wood was lost in the wind. Inch by painful inch, the fireman shimmied higher, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the crossarm, hooking a leg over the timber to stabilize himself. The wires were right there, vibrating with the tension of the storm. He hacked at the first wire with the knife. The copper was tough. He sawed at it frantically, the blade biting into the metal. With a sudden twang, the wire parted, curling away into the darkness like a struck snake. He moved to the second wire, then the third. One by one, the connections to the civilized world were severed, leaving the train and its occupants in a bubble of silence. While Dietrich worked on the wires, Harry Longabaugh moved to the edge of the trestle bridge, peering back toward the passenger cars. The lights in the coaches were being extinguished one by one as the passengers and crew tried to make themselves less of a target. However, movement caught his eye. A figure was advancing across the bridge, stepping carefully from tie to tie. It was Conductor Brooks. The man was brave, driven by a sense of responsibility to his train and his passengers. He carried a lantern, though he had shuttered it to a mere slit, trying to see what was happening to his engine. He could hear the shouting and the steam, but the rain obscured the details. He advanced slowly, the dark water of the creek swirling 10 feet below his boots. The bridge had no railings. A misstep meant a fall into the rocky, flooded gorge. Longabaugh raised his Winchester rifle. He did not intend to kill the conductor, not yet. Dead conductor brought too much heat, and the man was not an immediate threat, only a nuisance. The outlaw aimed high, targeting the heavy timber crossbeam of the bridge truss just above the conductor's head. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the muzzle flash illuminating the rain for a split second. The bullet slammed into the wood with a loud thwack, sending splinters raining down on Brooks. The sound of the shot rolled across the prairie like thunder. Brooks froze, dropping to a crouch on the wet ties. Longabaugh shouted across the gap, his voice projecting clearly over the water. He warned the conductor that the next one would be lower. He ordered him to go back to the coaches and keep the passengers inside if he wanted them to live to see sunrise. Brooks hesitated for only a second. He was a railroad man, not a soldier. He turned and scrambled back toward the safety of the passenger cars, his boots slipping on the wet wood. The message was received. The outlaws controlled the engine, the express car, and the bridge. The passengers were hostages, held in check by the threat of rifle fire and the impassable barrier of the trestle. Longabaugh held his position for a moment longer, ensuring no one else was foolish enough to attempt the crossing, before turning back to the work at the express car. Dietrich slid down the telegraph pole, landing heavily in the mud. He was exhausted, his hands bleeding from splinters and the rough handling of the wire. Logan did not offer a word of thanks. He merely gestured for the fireman to rejoin Jones near the tender. The environment was entirely hostile. The temperature had dropped further, the wind chilling the sweat on the men's bodies. The ground was a soup of clay that sucked at their boots with every step, making movement laboriously slow. The isolation was now total. No telegraph, no help from the rear, no passing trains. They were alone in the void. Logan turned his full attention to the express car. The dynamite charge that Dietrich had placed earlier was wedged against the door sill, but Logan was not ready to light it yet. He wanted to give the messenger one more chance. It was a matter of efficiency. An explosion could damage the money or the car in ways that made retrieval difficult. He walked up to the side of the car, slamming the butt of his revolver against the wood paneling. He shouted the name of the messenger, Wilcox. He knew the man's name. These gangs always did their homework. He told Wilcox that the wires were cut and the train was split. He told him there was no help coming. He offered a simple trade. Open the door, step out, and he would not be harmed. Inside the car, Charles Wilcox huddled in the darkness behind a barricade of crates. He heard the voice clearly. He heard the truth in the outlaw's words. The train had indeed moved. He had felt the separation. He knew he was cut off. But Wilcox was a man of stubborn integrity. He had sworn an oath to protect the contents of the car. He shouted back, his voice trembling but firm. He refused. He told them he would not open the door. He warned them that he was armed. It was a brave stand, but ultimately futile against the men standing in the rain. They were not common thieves. They were industrial saboteurs who used high explosives as lockpicks. Logan stepped back, shaking his head. He had expected this, but he had hoped for the easy way. He looked at Curry and Longabaugh. They nodded. The time for negotiation was finished. Logan approached the door again, shielding a match from the wind with his body. He lit the fuse on the bundle of dynamite wedged against the sill. The spark hissed and spat, the fuse sputtering as it caught. Logan turned and ran, diving behind the cover of the coal tender. Curry and Longabaugh forced the two crewmen, Jones and Dietrich, down into the mud behind the heavy steel wheels of the locomotive, using them as human shields against the blast and any potential shrapnel. The fuse burned quickly. For 5 seconds, the only sound was the storm. Then the world disintegrated. The explosion was not a dull thud, but a sharp, cracking roar that slapped the eardrums and vibrated through the chest. A flash of orange light tore the night apart, blinding everyone for a moment. The shockwave punched through the rain, flattening the grass for 20 yards in every direction. Wood splinters and metal fragments whistled through the air, clattering against the side of the tender and the boiler of the engine. The ground heaved. Smoke billowed from the side of the express car, mixing with the steam and the rain. Logan waited for the debris to stop falling before he moved. He stood up, his ears ringing, and walked through the smoke toward the car. He expected to see a gaping hole, a shattered door. What he saw made him curse. The door was damaged, scorched, and splintered, but it was still hanging on its hinges. The heavy oak reinforcement and the iron strapping had held. The charge had been too small or placed poorly. The fortress was breached, but the gate was still barred. Inside the car, Wilcox was dazed. The concussion had knocked him off his feet. Dust and smoke filled the interior, choking him. He coughed, his eyes watering. He scrambled back to his position, checking his revolver. He was still alive. The door was still closed. He shouted out again, a defiant yell that sounded thin and weak in the aftermath of the blast. He told them they would have to do better than that. Logan's face darkened. He was wet, cold, and now angry. The resistance of the messenger was becoming a personal insult. He turned to his saddlebags. He pulled out more dynamite, much more. He was done with precision. If the messenger wanted to die for the Union Pacific Railroad, that was his choice. Logan grabbed 3 large bundles of giant powder. He did not bother to separate them. He walked back to the car, ignoring the ringing in his ears. Jammed the explosives into the gap created by the first blast, forcing the sticks deep into the splintered wood. He wanted to make sure there was no question about the result this time. Curry watched him, a look of concern on his face. He shouted to Logan that he was using too much, that he would blow the whole car to kindling. Logan ignored him. He was operating on a level of frustration that demanded a definitive conclusion. He adjusted the fuses, twisting them together to ensure they lit simultaneously. He looked back at the crewman. Jones was pressing his face into the mud, covering his head with his arms. Dietrich was sobbing quietly. They knew what was coming. Logan lit the fuses. He didn't run this time. He walked back to the tender with a grim determination. He crouched beside the wheels, opening his mouth to equalize the pressure. He waited. The fuses hissed, snake-like in the wreckage of the door. The seconds stretched out, agonizingly long. The rain sizzled on the hot barrel of the rifle he held. The separation of the train was now more than physical. It was a separation of realities. On one side of the bridge, passengers sat in fear, wondering what the noise was. On this side, men were engaging in a war of attrition with high explosives. The telegraph wires lay in the mud, dead and useless. The track was blocked. The line was severed in every conceivable way. The only thing that remained was the finality of the next explosion. The outlaws checked their weapons again, almost out of habit. The moisture was everywhere. They had to keep the actions dry. Longabaugh wiped his rifle with a rag, keeping his eyes on the bridge. He knew that the first explosion would have alerted everyone for miles, if there was anyone for miles. But in this weather, sound carried strangely. It might be muffled by the wind, or it might echo off the clouds. Regardless, the clock was ticking. They couldn't spend all night blowing up one car. Logan looked at the express car. The smoke from the first blast was still drifting lazily in the rain. The new fuses were burning down, bright sparks eating their way toward the heavy charge. He thought about the man inside. Woodcock was either the bravest man he had ever met or the most foolish. It didn't matter now. The choice had been made. The line was cut. The fuse was burning. The wind picked up, howling through the cab of the locomotive, rattling the gauges. The headlight beam flickered as water dripped into the casing. The scene was a tableau of industrial violence set against the backdrop of a primordial storm. The outlaws, the crew, and the messenger were all trapped in this moment, waiting for the physics of the dynamite to take over. The damp air felt heavy, charged with the impending release of energy. The separation was absolute. There was no going back, no undoing the events of the last hour. The bridge was behind them, the open plains ahead, and right in front of them a wall of wood and iron that was about to cease to exist. The wait for the second explosion seemed to stretch time itself. Jones, the engineer, lifted his head slightly from the mud. He was a man who understood the power of steam and steel, the calculated risks of speed and pressure. But this, unregulated high explosives handled by desperate men, was a chaos he could not process. He looked at the heavy iron wheels of his locomotive, the machine he had tended with such care just hours before. Now it was merely a shield, a cold wall of metal protecting him from the wrath of the bandits. He felt the vibration of the ground, the deep, resonant thrum of the earth absorbing the pounding rain. He looked at Dietrich. The fireman was younger, less experienced. His eyes were squeezed shut, his lips moving in a silent prayer. The mud was caked in his ears and hair. Jones reached out and gripped the fireman's shoulder, a small gesture of solidarity in the face of annihilation. Logan, crouching nearby, observed the crewmen with a detached curiosity. To him, they were not people but tools that had served their purpose. He had no desire to kill them. A dead engineer was a complication, a reason for a hanging if they were caught. But if they moved, if they tried to run or fight, he would put them down without a second thought. His focus was entirely on the car. He ran the calculation in his head. The amount of powder he had used was excessive. He knew it. But the door had insulted him. The refusal of the messenger had insulted him. In the code of the outlaw, you asked once. If the answer was no, you removed the obstacle. The subtlety of a safecracker was not required here. This was a robbery, not a burglary. The storm intensified as if angered by the delay. Hail began to mix with the rain, small stones of ice that pinged off the boiler casing and stung the exposed skin of the men's hands and faces. The temperature plummeted further. The steam rising from the locomotive engine swirled in the turbulent air, creating ghostly shapes that danced in the headlight's beam. The smell of sulfur from the black powder fuse drifted back to them, acrid and distinct, cutting through the scent of wet sage and coal smoke. Longabaugh shifted his position, his boots squelching in the mire. He kept one eye on the bridge, but his peripheral vision was locked on the express car. He knew that when this charge went off, the integrity of the car would be compromised completely. The roof might blow off, the sides might buckle. The contents, the reason they were standing in this freezing hell, would be scattered. They would have to be quick to gather the loot before the wind blew it away or the fire consumed it. He mentally rehearsed the movement. Run in, grab the bags, get back to the horses. The horses? He hoped George Curry was keeping them calm. A detonation of this size would spook even the most battle-hardened mount. If the horses broke loose, they were walking to the hole in the wall, and that was a walk they wouldn't survive with a posse on their heels. The telegraph wires now lying in the mud were a tangled mess of copper and glass insulators. Dietrich's work had been sloppy but effective. The ends of the cut wires were buried in the slush, grounding out any current. The silence from the wires was deafening to those who knew what they represented. No frantic tapping of keys, no Morse code dots and dashes racing at the speed of light to alert the sheriff. The void was complete. They were in a dark pocket of the universe governed only by the laws of ballistics and chemistry. Jones watched the fuse burn down to the wood. The sparks were disappearing inside the shattered timber of the doorframe. He took a deep breath and held it, burying his face in his arms again. He pressed his body as flat as he could against the wet earth, trying to merge with the ground. He felt the cold seep into his stomach. He thought of his wife in Laramie, of the warm kitchen, of the coffee on the stove. The contrast between that memory and the freezing reality of the Wilcox sighting was sharp enough to cut. Logan didn't flinch. He watched the last inch of the fuse vanish. He counted the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3. The world held its breath. The rain seemed to hang suspended in the air. The locomotive hissed one last time, a sigh of steam before the violence. Then the spark reached the cap. The detonation of the second overloaded charge of dynamite tore the night apart with a violence that defied the scale of the landscape. It was not merely a sound, but a physical blow, a concussion that slammed against the wet earth and expanded outward in a spherical shockwave of compressed air and debris. On the eastern side of the wooden trestle bridge, the stranded passenger coaches of the Union Pacific Flyer rocked on their springs as if struck by a heavy gale. The glass in the windows rattled dangerously, some panes cracking under the pressure variance, sending spiderwebs of fractures shooting across the wet surfaces. Inside the darkened cars, the hundreds of passengers who had been murmuring in anxious tones were silenced instantly by the sheer magnitude of the blast. The roar rolled over them, a thunderclap that started at the front of the train and washed back to the caboose, leaving a ringing void in its wake. The wooden floorboards vibrated beneath their feet, transmitting the destruction occurring across the creek directly into the soles of their shoes. Harry Longabaugh, the man holding the perimeter at the bridgehead, had turned his back to the express car just seconds before the eruption. He crouched low behind the heavy timber piling of the bridge approach, pressing his hat down over his ears. Even with the protection of the wood and the distance, the blast punched the air from his lungs. He felt the heat of it, a momentary tropical wind in the freezing Wyoming storm, followed instantly by a shower of splinters, twisted metal, and soil that rained down upon the creek and the tracks. He did not flinch. He shook the debris from his oilskin slicker and immediately spun back around, bringing his Winchester rifle up to his shoulder. His eyes were not on the smoking ruin of the express car behind him. They were locked on the passenger coaches across the ravine. He knew that an explosion of that size would provoke a reaction. Fear made men unpredictable, and panic often masqueraded as bravery. If anyone on that train was armed and foolish enough to think they could intervene, they would make their move now, under the cover of the chaos. The trestle bridge itself stood as a grim, rain-slicked skeleton connecting the two halves of the severed train. It was a 50-foot span of creosote-soaked timber, open to the elements with no guardrails and only the slick, uneven spacing of the railroad ties to walk upon. Below the creek was a churning torrent of black water, swollen by the hours of relentless rainfall, rushing over jagged rocks with a noise that competed with the storm. The bridge was a choke point, a tactical funnel that reduced the numerical advantage of the train's population to zero. Only one man could cross at a time, balancing on the wet wood, illuminated by the lightning and the faint glow of the train's marker lights. Longabaugh controlled this fatal geometry. He was the gatekeeper, and his toll was paid in copper-jacketed .44 caliber projectiles. Inside the first passenger coach, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and stale tobacco, now laced with the sharp metallic tang of fear. Conductor Brooks, recovering from his earlier brush with death, moved down the aisle in a crouch. He carried no lantern now, having learned that light was a magnet for the riflemen outside. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones, ordering the passengers to stay down, to keep away from the windows, and to remain calm. But the panic was rising. A man in a heavy coat, a cattle buyer from Omaha, stood up in the center of the car, shouting that they were being murdered, that the train was being blown to pieces. He reached for the handle of the vestibule door, intent on escaping the confines of the car. Brooks lunged for him, grabbing his arm, but the man was strong with terror. He threw the conductor off and wrenched the door open. The cold wind and rain swirled into the heated car, bringing with it the noise of the storm and the distant shouts of the bandits. The cattle buyer stepped out onto the metal platform of the vestibule, looking toward the engine. He saw the smoke billowing from the express car across the creek, illuminated by the headlight of the severed locomotive. He saw the dark outline of the bridge, and then he saw the flash. From the darkness of the bridgehead, a single point of fire bloomed. The sound of the rifle shot was flat and sharp. A bullet struck the iron railing inches from the man's hand, sparking violently and sending a shard of metal slicing through the sleeve of his coat. The man yelped, scrambling backward into the car, falling over his own feet. He kicked the door shut with his boot and crawled down the aisle, his bravery evaporated. Longabaugh worked the lever of his Winchester, ejecting the spent brass casing into the mud. The action was smooth, mechanical, a rhythm he had perfected over years of hard use. He did not aim to kill the passenger. A dead passenger was a complication that brought federal heat. He aimed to instruct. The shot was a message, clear and undeniable. The bridge was closed. He scanned the windows of the coaches, looking for the glint of a barrel or the silhouette of a man taking aim. He saw nothing but darkness. The message had been received. The blockade was holding. The rain intensified, if that were possible, turning the world into a blurred gray curtain. Longabaugh wiped the water from his eyes, his gaze never wavering from the eastern bank. He knew that there were likely guns on that train. Every train in the West carried men who knew how to shoot, ranchers, soldiers, lawmen in transit. But the psychology of the situation was on his side. Those men were trapped in a lit box, or a box that had been lit, disoriented, separated from the threat by a deadly obstacle, and unsure of the number of attackers. To them, the darkness across the bridge was filled with an army of desperados. In reality, it was just him, cold and wet, guarding the rear while his partners worked on the safe. The illusion of overwhelming force was as important as the force itself. Down in the creek bed, the water rose higher, lapping at the wooden pilings of the trestle. The sound of the rushing water was a constant roaring backdrop to the standoff. It served as a sonic wall, masking the specific sounds of the robbery, the voices of Logan and Curry, the groans of the train crew from the passengers. To the people in the coaches, the events across the bridge were a silent pantomime of violence, punctuated only by the massive concussions of the dynamite. This sensory deprivation increased their terror. They could not hear if the engineer was begging for his life. They could not hear if the express messenger was screaming. They could only imagine, and their imaginations painted pictures far worse than the reality. Longabaugh shifted his position, moving to the other side of the bridge abutment to change his angle. He did not want to stay in one spot too long. A stationary target was a dead target. He checked the load in his rifle. He had plenty of ammunition in his pockets, the heavy cartridges weighing down his slicker. He was prepared to hold this spot all night if necessary. He watched the vestibules of the cars specifically. Those were the exit points. If an assault came, it would come from there. He saw a shadow move in the second car, a brakeman trying to peer out through the glass of the door. Longabaugh lifted the rifle again, tracking the movement. The brakeman saw the movement of the bandit, or perhaps just felt the weight of the gaze, and ducked back out of sight. The isolation of the passenger train was total. With the telegraph wires cut and the track blocked, they were an island of civilization stranded in a wilderness that had suddenly turned hostile. The luxury of the Pullman cars, the velvet seats, the polished wood paneling, all of it was rendered meaningless by the man with the rifle at the bridge. The social order of the railroad, where the conductor was the captain and the schedule was the law, had been overturned. Here the law was the Winchester, and the schedule was dictated by the burn rate of a fuse. Longabaugh glanced back quickly over his shoulder. The smoke from the explosion was clearing. He could see Logan and Curry moving near the express car. They were still working. That meant the job wasn't done. He turned back to the bridge. His job was patience. He had to maintain a level of vigilance that was exhausting. The cold was seeping through his layers, numbing his fingers, but he forced his hands to stay dexterous. He flexed his grip on the rifle stock. He listened to the wind, filtering out the natural sounds to hunt for the artificial ones. The click of a hammer, the squeak of a door hinge, the crunch of a boot on ballast. On the passenger side, the fear was beginning to curdle into a dull, aching dread. The initial panic had subsided, replaced by a realization of helplessness. The men who had spoken of rushing the bandits were now silent, sitting on the floor or hunched in their seats. They realized that to cross that bridge was suicide. The structure was 50 feet of open killing ground. There was no cover. The ties were slick with rain. A man running across would be silhouette against the sky, a target a child could hit. And even if they made it across, they would be running straight into the guns of the men who had just blown a train car apart. The arithmetic of survival dictated that they sit and wait. Longabaugh knew this calculation was going through their heads. He counted on it. He watched the train as a predator watches a herd, looking for the outlier, the one who breaks the pattern. He saw a lantern flicker in the distance near the rear of the train. Someone was signaling, perhaps trying to send a message to a station behind them. It was a futile gesture. The curvature of the earth and the storm would swallow the light long before it reached human eyes. He let them signal. It gave them something to do, a false sense of agency that kept them occupied and off the bridge. The rain drummed on the roof of the passenger cars, a relentless noise that eroded the nerves. Inside, mothers held their children tight, muffling their cries. The air was getting cold as the steam heat from the disconnected engine faded from the pipes. The physical separation of the train was manifesting in the temperature. The engine was warmth and life. The cars were becoming cold, dead containers. The passengers were beginning to understand the full scope of their predicament. They were not just being robbed, they were being discarded. Longabaugh adjusted his stance. His boots were deep in the mud, providing a solid anchor. He felt the vibration of the ground again, a tremor that had nothing to do with dynamite. It was the train itself, the heavy cars settling into the sodden roadbed. The storm was washing away the stability of the world. He looked at the creek again. A large branch torn from a tree upstream came rushing down the current, slamming into the bridge, piling with a dull thud. The structure groaned but held. It was built to withstand nature, if not high explosives. A sudden noise from the passenger train drew his focus sharp. A window in the third car slid open. A man leaned out, holding a small revolver. He fired blindly into the night, the shots popping like firecrackers, the bullets flying wild into the sagebrush hundreds of yards wide of the bandits. It was a panic reaction, a man shooting at the darkness because the darkness terrified him. Longabaugh did not return fire. He watched the muzzle flashes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The gun clicked empty. The man withdrew, slamming the window shut. Longabaugh shook his head. Amateurs. They wasted ammunition on ghosts. He saved his for flesh and blood. The wind shifted, blowing the rain directly into Longabaugh's face. He pulled his bandana up over his nose, shielding his skin from the stinging drops. The water ran down his neck, a cold trickle that made him shiver. He ignored it. Comfort was a luxury for tomorrow. Tonight was about control. He checked the bridge approach again. No footprints in the mud on the far side, no shadows moving on the ties. The blockade was absolute. He thought about the men inside the cars. There were probably 100 people or more, against 6. The numbers were absurd, but the dynamic of violence was not democratic. It was not about votes. It was about who held the initiative. The bandits held the initiative. They had defined the terms of the engagement. They had chosen the ground, the time, and the method. The passengers were merely reacting, lagging behind the curve of events. As long as Longabaugh held the bridge, that dynamic would remain frozen. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. The storm showed no mercy. Lightning flashes were fewer now, leaving the scene in a deeper, more profound darkness. The only light was the headlight of the locomotive, a single eye staring away from the scene, and the faint, dying glow of the firebox reflecting off the steam. The passenger cars were almost entirely dark now, a long black snake lying dead on the prairie. This was the stillness of the blockade. It was not a passive state, but an active suppression, a weight of threat pressing down on the victims. Longabaugh stamped his feet to restore circulation. He kept the rifle tucked close to his body to keep the action relatively dry. He was a professional at work. He did not enjoy the terror he was inflicting, nor did he regret it. It was a necessary component of the job, like the dynamite or the horses. You controlled the crowd to protect the crew. It was a safety regulation written in the outlaw handbook. He heard a metallic clang from behind him, the sound of a sledgehammer on iron. His partners were breaking something. That was good. Progress. He kept his eyes forward. The passengers heard it too. The sound drifted across the ravine, a reminder that the violation of the train was continuing. It caused a ripple of fresh anxiety in the cars, a stirring of bodies, but no one moved toward the doors. The memory of the rifle shot was still fresh. The invisible line drawn across the bridge was as solid as a stone wall. The water in the creek seemed to be rising still. It swirled around the timber supports, foaming and angry. If the rain kept up, the bridge might not hold until morning. That wasn't his problem. He only needed it to hold for another hour. Just long enough to strip the car and mount up. After that, the bridge could wash away to the Gulf of Mexico for all he cared. He scanned the horizon to the east, looking for any sign of a rescue train. Nothing. The tracks were empty black ribbons. The isolation held. The blockade was not just the bridge, it was the entire storm, the night, the miles of empty Wyoming sod. They were locked in a bubble of time, separated from the rest of the world by a barrier of fear and geography. Longabaugh exhaled, his breath steaming in the cold air. He settled back against the wet wood of the piling, the guardian of the abyss watching the sleeping dragon of the passenger train, daring it to wake up. The tension was a physical weight. It hung in the air, heavier than the rain. Every minute that passed was a victory for the blockade. Every minute without a rush, without a hero, without a firefight, was a minute closer to the escape. Longabaugh was the anchor. As long as he stood there, the train remained divided, and the robbery could proceed with the mechanical precision it required. He waited for the next move, the next sound, the next flash of lightning, ready to dispense his copper toll to anyone who tried to cross his bridge. Inside the third coach, a young woman pressed her face against the cold glass of the window, cupping her hands around her eyes to block out the reflection. She could see nothing but the driving rain and the occasional phantom shape created by the storm. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The cold was biting now. The steam pipes had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and the car was losing heat rapidly to the Wyoming night. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the coughing of a man in the rear and the low rhythmic sobbing of a child. The fear here was not the sharp, adrenaline-fueled panic of the first few minutes. It was a slow, creeping dread. It was the fear of the unknown. Who were these men? How many were there? Would they come to the passenger cars next? The uncertainty was a torture all its own. Conductor Brooks sat on the armrest of a seat near the front of the car, his posture slumped. He felt the weight of his failure, though there was nothing he could have done. He had tried to investigate. He had been shot at. He had tried to organize a defense, but the passengers were civilians, confused and terrified. He looked at the door to the vestibule. It remained closed. He knew that outside in the rain a man was watching that door, a man who did not miss. Brooks had seen the splinters fly from the bridge timber. That was a marksman's shot, placed with intent. He knew that to send anyone out there was to send them to their death. So he waited. He became a jailer, keeping his passengers inside for their own safety, enforcing the blockade that the outlaws had established. Back at the bridgehead, Longabaugh felt the strain in his legs. Crouching in the mud was exhausting work. He stood, up slowly, keeping behind the cover of the heavy wooden post. He stretched his back, hearing the joints pop. He was soaked through. The oilskin kept the worst of the rain off, but the dampness was pervasive. It seeped in through the collar, up the sleeves, down the boots. His hands were white and wrinkled like a washerwoman's, but his trigger finger remained sensitive. He rubbed his hands together briskly, generating a friction of warmth, then gripped the rifle again. He looked at the creek below. The water was carrying more debris now. Logs, branches, clumps of sod. The storm was washing the high country clean. The bridge shuddered as a heavy log struck a piling. The vibration traveled up through his boots. He hoped the bridge would last. It would be a supreme irony if the creek did the posse's work for them and washed away their escape route. But the bridge held. It was Union Pacific built, over-engineered and solid. Longabaugh shifted his gaze back to the train. He saw a match flare in one of the windows. Someone lighting a pipe or a cigar. The small flame illuminated a face for a brief second, a man with a mustache, looking worried. Then the match went out, and the face vanished. It was a glimpse of the humanity he was suppressing. These were people with lives, destinations, families. Tonight they were just obstacles. Cargo. He felt no animosity toward them, but he felt no empathy either. They were part of the equation, variables to be managed. The wind howled through the trestle work. creating a mournful whistling sound that sounded like a ghostly choir. It was a fitting soundtrack for the night. The Wild Bunch was living up to its name. They had stopped the flyer, split it in two, and were now dismantling it piece by piece. And he, the Sundance Kid, was the hinge upon which the whole operation turned. If he failed, if he let the passengers cross, the gang would be flanked. They would be pinned against the express car and cut down. He accepted the responsibility with a stoic calm. He was the wall, and tonight the wall was impenetrable. The rain began to slacken slightly, transitioning from a deluge to a steady rhythmic shower. This improved visibility slightly, which was both good and bad. He could see the train better, but they could see him better too if he wasn't careful. He pressed closer to the timber. He checked the skyline. He was still invisible against the dark background of the hills. The passengers were backlit by the faint ambient light of the remaining lanterns in the cars. The advantage remained his. He heard the heavy thud of the sledgehammer again. Logan was persistent. The safe must be stubborn. Longabaugh checked his pocket watch, shielding the face with his hand. It was getting late, or early. Time was blurring. They couldn't stay here forever. Eventually the sun would rise or a relief train would come from the west. They needed to finish this soon. But until Logan gave the whistle, Longabaugh would stay at his post. He would stand in the mud and the rain, a solitary sentinel ensuring that the bridge remained a bridge to nowhere. He watched a drop of water form on the end of his rifle barrel. It hung there for a moment, catching a stray glint of light before falling into the mud. It was a small detail, but in the heightened state of his senses it seemed significant. Everything was significant. The shifting of the wind, the groan of the timber, the silence of the train. He was tuned into the frequency of the night. He was the master of the blockade, and for now nothing moved without his permission. The echo of the massive detonation described in the previous moments finally died away, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. Harvey Logan pushed himself up from the mud behind the locomotive tender, shaking the debris from his slicker. The world around him had changed in the blink of an eye. The solid shape of the express car, which had loomed in the darkness just seconds ago, was simply gone. In its place, a cloud of acrid white smoke swirled in the rain, illuminated by the wavering beam of the locomotive headlight. Splinters of wood and twisted pieces of iron were scattered across the wet earth for a radius of 50 yards, some still smoking despite the downpour. The violence of the overloaded charge had been absolute. It had not merely breached the car, but had atomized it. Logan signaled to George Curry, who was rising unsteadily from his own cover near the driving wheels. They moved forward into the smoke, their boots crunching on a carpet of shattered glass and pulverized timber. The smell was overpowering, a choking mixture of sulfur, burnt nitrate, and ozone that stung the nostrils and watered the eyes. As they stepped onto the track where the car had stood, they saw the chassis, a flat, scorched platform stripped of its walls and roof. The blast had acted like a giant, invisible fist punching the superstructure outward and upward, leaving the floorboards naked and charred. In the center of this devastation, amidst the ruin of mailbags and splintered crates, lay a pile of debris that moved slightly. Logan approached it, his revolver drawn, though he doubted anyone could have survived the concussion. He kicked aside a heavy beam. Beneath it, curled in a tight ball under a shred of canvas, was Charles Woodcock. The express messenger was alive, shielded by the barricade he had built and the capriciousness of the blast wave. He was dazed, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his uniform torn and covered in soot. He looked up at the outlaws with eyes that couldn't focus, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The explosion had likely ruptured his eardrums, leaving him in a silent, spinning world. Curry grabbed the messenger by the collar and dragged him roughly toward the edge of the platform, lowering him down into the mud. He gestured for the engineer Jones to come forward. Jones, terrified and pale, scrambled out from behind the engine and took charge of the injured man, pulling him further away from the wreckage. The outlaws ignored them. Their attention was fixed on the only object that had remained standing on the platform: the safe. The heavy iron box was a testament to industrial engineering. It was scorched black, dented by flying shrapnel, and stripped of its wooden casing, but it sat anchored to the floor beams, immovable and defiant. Logan ran his gloved hand over the surface. The metal was hot. He checked the door. The explosion had ripped the car apart, but the safe remained locked. The dial was smashed, useless, but the bolts held. The sheer stubbornness of the steel was infuriating. They had used enough dynamite to level a building, and still the money was out of reach. Logan turned to the tool bag. The brute force approach had cleared the way, but now they needed concentrated power. He pulled out the hammer and a set of steel wedges. He didn't want to destroy the contents. He wanted to peel the door. He set a chisel against the upper seam of the safe door, where the heat and shock had created a hairline fracture. He swung the hammer. The clang of steel on steel rang out, sharp and distinct in the night air. He struck it again and again, driving the wedge deep into the gap. Curry stood guard, watching the darkness beyond the light. He was nervous. The violence of the last blast would have been heard for miles. Every minute they spent playing blacksmith was a minute the posse was getting closer. He urged Logan to hurry. Logan didn't look up. He was focused on the crack. He needed it wide enough to accept the explosive. He worked with a rhythmic intensity, sweat mixing with the rain on his face. He was cutting a key out of dynamite. When the gap was wide enough, Logan threw down the hammer. He grabbed the remaining sticks of giant powder. He didn't use the full sticks this time. He crumbled the explosive material out of the paper, creating a putty-like substance. He began to pack this paste into the crack he had widened, forcing it deep into the mechanism of the safe. He molded it around the hinges and the locking bolts. It was delicate work requiring a steady hand. One spark from a slipped chisel, one moment of friction, and he would be vaporized. The rain continued to fall, sizzling on the hot metal of the safe. The steam mixed with the smoke, creating a fog that wrapped around the men. They were isolated in this bubble of light and noise, disconnected from the rest of the world. The engineer and fireman watched from the shadows huddled over the injured messenger. They were witnesses to a scene from hell, men working with fire and explosives in a graveyard of wreckage. Logan finished packing the charge. He inserted a new fulminate cap and crimped it with his teeth, a dangerous habit that old dynamiters never broke. He cut a short fuse. He looked at Curry. "Get back!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. They retreated again, moving back to the locomotive tender. The routine was grimly familiar now. The waiting, the anticipation, the knowledge of the violence to come. But this time, it was different. This wasn't a blind blast. It was a surgical strike. Logan lit the fuse. He walked, didn't run, back to cover. He crouched down, covering his ears. He watched the spark hiss into the safe door. The third explosion was sharp, a high-pitched crack like a thunderbolt striking an anvil. It lacked the deep, earth-shaking resonance of the previous blast, but its energy was focused entirely on the steel. A flash of light blinded them for a second. The sound of rending metal shrieked through the canyon. Logan was up before the debris landed. He sprinted to the platform. The smoke was thinner this time. He shone his lantern on the safe. The heavy iron door had been blown clean off its hinges. It lay on the floorboards, twisted and smoking. The interior of the safe was exposed. He reached inside. The first thing he felt was the canvas of a bag. He pulled it out. It was heavy. The seal was broken, but the contents were there. Gold. He reached in again. Bundles of paper, banknotes. Some were singed around the edges, but the stacks were thick and solid. He turned to Curry and let out a whoop of triumph that was lost in the wind. The overloaded fuse had done its work. It had destroyed the car, stunned the guard, and finally cracked the nut. They stood amidst the ruin of the Union Pacific's property, holding the wealth of a small town in their hands, ready to begin the next phase of their escape. Logan held the lantern closer, shielding it from the rain with his slicker. The bills were unsigned. This was a crucial detail. These notes were not yet legal tender in the strictest sense. They required the signatures of the bank president and cashier to be valid. To the average shopkeeper or saloon owner, however, a $20 bill was a $20 bill, regardless of the scribbles at the bottom. To the outlaws, this meant the money was fresh, sequential, and untraceable until the numbers were recorded and distributed to banks across the country, a process that would take weeks. The sheer volume of the currency was staggering. As Logan continued to empty the safe, the pile of loot grew. There were packages of $10 bills, $20 bills, and hundreds. The total estimate, based on the size and density of the bundles, was somewhere over $30,000. In the high plains of Wyoming in 1899, this was a sum that exceeded the lifetime earnings of everyone currently standing at the Wilcox siding combined. It was a fortune that could buy a ranch, a new identity, or a great deal of protection. But right now, on the rain-swept platform, it was a logistical nightmare. The paper money was vulnerable. If the rain soaked through the wrappers, the bills would stick together, rot, or become fragile. Logan worked with a frantic speed, shouting for Curry to bring the saddlebags up to the platform. Curry scrambled up the side of the wreckage, hauling the heavy leather saddlebags they had brought for this exact purpose. They began to stuff the money into the bags. It was a crude, violent process. They jammed the neat bundles of treasury notes into the leather pouches, crushing the corners, disregarding the neatness of the bank's packaging. The gold sacks went into the bottom of the bags to anchor them, followed by the lighter paper. The outlaws were breathing hard, the adrenaline of the robbery mixing with the physical exertion of moving hundreds of pounds of currency. The rain continued to fall, slicking the leather and making the buckles slippery and difficult to manage. Every second they spent packing was a second the paper was exposed to the elements. Harry Longabaugh, still holding the perimeter at the bridge, glanced back toward the engine. He could see the lanterns bobbing on the platform and the frantic movement of his partners. He knew they had hit the mother lode. The body language was unmistakable. Men didn't move with that kind of desperate energy for a sack of mail or a few registered letters. They were handling weight. He kept his rifle trained on the passenger cars, but his mind began to calculate the ride ahead. Carrying this much weight would slow the horses. They would have to manage the animals carefully in the mud. The escape would be a test of horsemanship as much as speed. Back at the locomotive, the packing was finished. Logan cinched the straps of the last saddlebag, pulling the leather tongue tight until the holes aligned. He buckled it down, testing the closure. The bags were bulging, heavy, and awkward. He threw one over his shoulder, the strap digging into his muscle. He looked at the empty safe. There were still loose papers inside, waybills, insurance documents, personal letters, but nothing of value. He left them. The wind caught a loose manifest and blew it out of the safe, carrying it away into the dark sagebrush. Logan turned his attention to the train crew. Jones and Dietrich were still huddled by the tender, watching the looting with a mixture of fear and awe. They had witnessed the destruction of their train and the theft of a fortune. They were witnesses, liabilities. But Logan was practical. Killing them would bring a level of heat that would never cool. The railroad police would hunt a robber. The entire nation would hunt a murderer. He decided they would live. However, they still had a use. The outlaws' horses were tied in a ravine nearly a mile to the north and west. Walking that distance in the mud with 50 pounds of loot each was inefficient and dangerous. they would use the machine. Logan jumped down from the platform, his boots splashing heavily in the puddles. He ordered Jones and Dietrich to get back into the cab of the locomotive. The engineer hesitated, looking at the twisted rails where the express car had stood. He stammered that the track might be damaged, that the engine might derail. Logan did not care for the engineering assessment. He pointed the barrel of his Colt toward the cab steps. He told Jones that if the engine derailed, they would walk. But until then, the wheels would turn. Jones scrambled up the gangway, followed by Dietrich. The outlaws passed the heavy saddlebags up to the crew, forcing them to haul the stolen money into the cab. Then Logan and Curry climbed aboard, joining Longabaugh, who ran in from his position at the bridge as soon as he heard the whistle signal. The cab of the number 1 was crowded. 3 large outlaws, 2 terrified crewmen, and 3 massive bags of money filled the small space. The heat from the firebox was intense, a sudden stifling contrast to the freezing rain outside. Their clothes began to steam instantly. The smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, tobacco, and coal smoke was thick enough to taste. Logan stood behind Jones, the muzzle of his gun pressed against the engineer's kidney. He ordered him to release the brakes and open the throttle. He wanted to move west, across the bridge, and down the track to a point where the terrain allowed for an easier exit to the north. Jones released the air brakes. The hiss of the escaping pressure was loud in the cab. He pulled the throttle lever. The locomotive, unburdened by the heavy train cars, surged forward with a sudden lurch. The drive wheels spun on the wet iron, the screech of metal on metal tearing through the night before catching traction. The engine moved away from the scene of the explosion, leaving the shattered remains of the express car and the stranded passenger coaches behind in the darkness. They rolled across the trestle bridge, the hollow roar of the wheels on the timbers echoing over the rushing creek. Longabaugh watched out the rear window, ensuring no one from the passenger train was foolish enough to try and follow on foot. The darkness swallowed the lights of the coaches quickly. They traveled for 2 miles. The rhythmic chuffing of the stack and the clanking of the side rods were the only sounds. The headlight cut a cone of illumination through the storm, revealing nothing but the endless sodden prairie and the parallel lines of the track. Logan watched the landmarks. He was looking for a specific milepost, a marker that aligned with the drainage leading to their horses. When he saw the white post flash by in the light, he ordered Jones to stop. The engineer closed the throttle and applied the brakes. The locomotive shuddered and coasted to a halt. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by absolute blackness. Logan ordered the crew to stay in the cab. He warned them that if they reversed the engine or blew the whistle before sunrise, he would ride back and put a bullet in the boiler. It was a bluff. The outlaws would be miles away by then, but it was effective. Jones nodded, his face pale and streaked with soot. He had no intention of being a hero, he just wanted to go home. The outlaws threw the saddlebags down from the cab, the heavy sacks landing with a wet thud in the soft earth beside the track. They climbed down after them. The transition from the warm, vibrating cab to the cold, silent ground was jarring. The rain was still falling, though it had lightened to a steady, freezing drizzle. The wind was relentless. They stood for a moment, adjusting their loads. Each man took a saddlebag. The weight was significant. Slung over a shoulder, the bag pulled the body down, throwing off balance. They had to walk from the tracks to the ravine, a distance of several hundred yards through uneven, sage-choked ground. The mud was the consistency of glue. It clung to their boots in heavy clumps, adding pounds to every step. They moved away from the tracks, disappearing into the night. They did not look back at the locomotive. The engine sat idling on the main line, a dark beast breathing steam, its crew paralyzed by fear. The outlaws focused on the ground in front of them, navigating by the faint gray shapes of the terrain. The walk was grueling. The sagebrush snagged their slickers and scratched at their legs. The ground was riddled with gopher holes and washouts hidden by the darkness. Curry stumbled, going down on one knee, the bag of gold slamming into the dirt. He cursed, struggling to rise under the weight. Logan stopped, waiting for him, his breathing heavy. This was the reality of the robbery. It was hard, physical labor. They reached the edge of the ravine. Below, in the shelter of the cut bank, the horses were waiting. The animals sensed the approach of the men and shifted nervously, their hooves splashing in the shallow runoff that flowed through the bottom of the gulch. The outlaws slid down the muddy embankment, their boots skiing through the clay. They landed at the bottom, muddy and exhausted. The horses were wet and shivering, their heads low. They had been standing in the storm for hours. Logan moved to his mount, a sturdy bay gelding. He spoke to it softly, running his hand along its neck to calm it. The horse tossed its head, the whites of its eyes showing in the gloom. It smelled the dynamite smoke and the anxiety of the men. The loading of the loot onto the horses was a critical task. They could not simply drape the bags over the saddle horns. The weight would pound the horses' withers and cause sores or lameness within miles. They had to secure the bags behind the cantle, tying them down with leather thongs to keep them from bouncing. Logan worked with stiff, numb fingers. He lashed the heavy bag to his saddle, pulling the knots tight with his teeth. The horse grunted as the weight settled onto its back. The suspension of the animal dropped an inch. This was a heavy load for a fast ride. They would have to manage the pace. A blown horse meant capture, and capture meant hanging. Longabaugh checked his cinch. The rain had caused the leather to stretch. He tightened it, the horse swelling its belly in protest. He kneed the animal in the gut, forcing it to exhale, and pulled the strap another 2 inches. The saddle had to be rock solid. If it slipped during a gallop in the dark, the rider would be crushed. He checked his rifle scabbard, ensuring the Winchester was secure but accessible. He checked his revolvers. Everything was wet, but everything was ready. They mounted up. The leather creaked loudly. The horses danced in the mud, eager to move, eager to generate heat. Logan took the lead. He turned his horse's head to the north toward the Casper Mountains. The hole in the wall was a long ride away. Days of hard travel through some of the roughest country in Wyoming. But they had the head start. They had the darkness. And they had the money. They rode out of the ravine, the horses scrambling up the steep bank. As they crested the ridge, the wind hit them with full force. It howled across the open plain, driving the sleet into their faces. Logan pulled his hat low, shielding his eyes. He looked at the compass in his head. North by northwest, keep the wind on the left cheek, keep moving. The first hour of the ride was a test of endurance. The mud was deep and the horses struggled to find footing. They moved at a trot, a jarring, bone-rattling pace that covered ground but punished the rider. The weight of the money bags slapped against the saddles, a rhythmic thudding that matched the hoofbeats. $30,000. It was a number that kept circling in Logan's mind. It was enough to disappear. Enough to go to South America. Enough to live like kings. But first, they had to survive the night. They rode in silence, 3 dark shapes moving through a darker world. The storm was their cover. No posse could track them in this. The rain washed their trail away as soon as they made it. The mud filled their hoofprints. They were ghosts passing through the landscape without leaving a mark. But the physical toll was real. The cold seeped through the oilskins, through the wool, into the bone. Their hands were frozen claws on the reins. Their legs ached from the strain of gripping the wet saddles. They crossed a swollen creek, the water rushing up to the horses' bellies. The animals plunged in, fighting the current. The water was icy, shocking the horses and the men. They scrambled up the far bank, water streaming from their flanks. They didn't stop. To stop was to freeze. They kept moving, pushing deeper into the wilderness. The civilization of the railroad, the telegraph, and the law was falling behind them with every mile. They were entering the wild country, the outlaw country, where the only rules were the ones they made themselves. As the night wore on, the adrenaline faded completely, leaving only exhaustion. Logan fought to keep his eyes open. The hypnotic rhythm of the horse, the endless gray curtain of the rain, the darkness, it all conspired to put him to sleep. He shook his head violently, slapping his own face. He couldn't sleep. A sleeping man fell off his horse. A sleeping man got caught. He focused on the movement of the horse's ears, on the shape of the horizon. He focused on the money. The loot was a burden, a heavy, wet, troublesome burden, but it was also the fuel that kept them going. They had done what few men dared to do. They had stopped the flyer, they had blown the safe, they had taken the gold. It was a feat of brute force and audacity. Now they just had to finish the job, they had to get away. The horizon to the east began to lighten imperceptibly. The black turned to a deep charcoal gray. Dawn was coming. With the light came the danger of being seen. They needed to find cover. They needed a canyon, a cave, a thicket where they could hide for the day. They couldn't ride in the open during daylight. Not with this load. Not with the telegraph lines humming with the news of their crime. Logan signaled to the others. He pointed toward a dark line of jagged rocks in the distance. Teapot Rock. It was a landmark. Good cover. Defensible. They turned their horses toward it. The animals sensed the change in destination, the promise of rest. They picked up their pace, their heads bobbing. The outlaws rode on, carrying their fortune through the mud. They were rich men now, in theory. But in practice, they were just wet, cold fugitives on tired horses running for their lives across a landscape that didn't care if they lived or died. The banknotes in the saddlebags were unsigned, invalid, just paper. But the gold was real. And the danger was real. And the ride was far from over. The silence that settled over the Wilcox siding after the departure of the three outlaws was not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, stunned vacuum left in the wake of extreme violence. The rain continued to fall, a cold and indifferent wash that diluted the blood on the forehead of express messenger Charles Woodcock and turned the soot-stained wreckage of the express car into a black slurry. For several minutes, no one moved. The darkness was absolute save for the single wavering beam of the locomotive headlight, which cut a white tunnel through the storm, illuminating only the empty track where the bandits had vanished. Jones, the engineer, sat in the cab of the locomotive, his hand still gripping the cold brass of the throttle, his breathing shallow and ragged. Beside him, Dietrich, the fireman, stared at the floorboards, his body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline and terror. They were alone in the vast Wyoming wilderness, two men in a steam engine that felt less like a machine of progress and more like a steel cage. The first sign of returning life came from the passenger coaches stranded on the eastern side of the trestle bridge. Conductor Brooks, having waited an agonizing interval to ensure the rifleman at the bridgehead was truly gone, stepped out of the vestibule of the first car. He moved cautiously, descending the metal steps into the mud. His lantern shuddered to a thin slit. He stopped at the edge of the bridge, listening. He heard only the wind and the rushing water of the creek. He called out, his voice sounding thin and fragile against the roar of the elements. There was no answer. No gunshot cracked from the darkness. He walked out onto the wet timbers of the trestle, his boots slipping on the slick creosote, moving toward the locomotive. As he crossed the divide that had separated the hostages from the robbery, he saw the full extent of the devastation. The express car was simply gone, replaced by a smoking flatbed and a debris field that looked as if it had been churned by artillery fire. Brooks climbed into the cab, his face pale and drawn. He found the crew alive but shaken. The reunion was brief and functional. There was no time for commiseration. They were railroad men, and the schedule had been shattered. The immediate imperative was communication. They needed to report the crime, they needed to get the injured messenger to a doctor, and they needed to clear the main line. Jones explained that the bandits had ridden north. Brooks looked at the severed telegraph wires dangling uselessly in the mud near the track. The primary nervous system of the Union Pacific had been severed. They could not tap out a message here. They had to move. The engineer reversed the locomotive, backing it slowly across the trestle bridge to couple with the stranded passenger cars. The clank of the knuckle couplers engaging was a solid, reassuring sound of mechanical order returning to chaos. The air hoses were reconnected, and the hiss of the brake system recharging signaled that the train was whole again, albeit scarred and carrying a cargo of traumatized passengers. Jones opened the throttle, and the Overland Flyer number 1, now hours behind schedule and missing its express car, began to limp westward. They were not heading to their original destination, but to the nearest station with a working telegraph key. Medicine Bow. The journey to Medicine Bow was a somber funeral procession of iron. The train moved through the pre-dawn darkness, the wheels clicking a rhythmic cadence that seemed to mock the crew. Inside the coaches, the passengers sat in stunned silence, the earlier panic having settled into a deep, exhausted dread. They arrived at the small depot just as the first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the eastern sky. The station agent, roused from his sleep by the unexpected arrival, was met by the sight of the battered train and the grim-faced conductor. Brooks bypassed the pleasantries and went straight to the telegraph table. He scribbled a message on a pad, his hand shaking slightly, and handed it to the operator. The operator read the words, his eyes widening, and immediately reached for the key. The copper circuit closed. The sound of the brass key clicking against the anvil filled the small room. ... It was a sharp staccato language that traveled at the speed of lightning, racing down the wires that ran parallel to the tracks. The message was concise and devastating. Number 1 held up at Wilcox. Express car blown. Safe robbed. Messenger injured. Bandits fled north. The signal shot out of Medicine Bow, relaying through the repeater stations, bypassing the dead air at Wilcox, and screaming toward the dispatch offices in Cheyenne, Laramie, and Omaha. The wires, silent and dead at the scene of the crime, were now alive with the news of the outrage. In Cheyenne, the heart of the Union Pacific's Mountain Division, the message arrived with the force of a physical blow. The night dispatcher tore the tape from the machine, reading the code as it chattered out. He wasted no time. Runners were sent into the wet streets of the city to wake the hierarchy. W.C. Brown, the superintendent, was roused from his bed. Determining the scale of the robbery required only seconds. The Union Pacific did not tolerate interference with its operations. This was not just a theft. It was an act of war against the corporation. The response was mobilized with the efficiency of a military campaign. The railroad had vast resources, and it intended to bring them all to bear. Simultaneously, the news reached the sheriff's office in Albany County and was relayed to the neighboring jurisdictions. In Converse County, Sheriff Joe Hazen received the word. Hazen was a man of the New West, a lawman who understood that the days of the wild outlaw were numbered, but who possessed the old instincts required to hunt them. He did not view this as a romantic adventure. He viewed it as a job. He began to organize immediately, deputizing men who could ride hard and shoot straight. The word went out to the ranches and the saloons. A posse was forming. The wires continued to hum, coordinating the convergence of law enforcement from 3 counties. The net was being cast, stitched together by electricity and anger. Back in Cheyenne, the railroad officials ordered the preparation of a special train. This was not a passenger excursion. It was a weapon system on rails. A locomotive was fired up in the roundhouse, the hostlers working with frantic speed to build steam pressure. Behind it, they coupled a stock car for horses, a flat car for a wagon, and a sleeper for the men. This was the Super Posse train, a mobile base of operations designed to deposit fresh men and fresh mounts directly at the point of the trail. The Union Pacific was not content to let local lawmen handle this alone. They were sending their own special agents, men like Timothy Kelleher and Joe LaForce, trackers who knew the country and the men who hid in it. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Cheyenne a mire of mud, but the activity at the depot was feverish. Horses were led up the loading ramps into the stock cars. These were not the tired, wet animals the outlaws were riding. These were grain-fed, rested mounts, chosen for stamina. Crates of ammunition, repeating rifles, and supplies were loaded into the baggage car. The men who boarded the train were a grim collection of professionals. There were U.S. Marshals, railroad detectives, and hired guns. They wore heavy canvas coats and wide-brimmed hats, their weapons kept dry and close. There was no boasting, no loud talk of what they would do to the bandits. They smoked their cigarettes and checked their gear, knowing that the task ahead was one of endurance and hardship. The wires continued to scream throughout the day. Reports came in from other stations. Section gangs were interrogated. Had anyone seen riders? Had anyone bought horses? The telegraph network acted as a giant radar system, pinging for any anomaly in the empty landscape. The station agent at Casper reported nothing. The agent at Rock Creek reported nothing. This negative information was crucial. It helped define the perimeter. The bandits were in the void, somewhere between the railroad and the mountains, in the vast, unpoliced emptiness of the basin. The dispatchers moved pins on large wall maps, triangulating the likely escape routes. They knew the terrain. They knew the hole in the wall. They knew where the water was. As the special train steamed out of Cheyenne, heading northwest toward the robbery site, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in 2 days. It shone on a landscape that was washing clean of the crime. The mud at Wilcox would be drying, the tracks hardening. But the telegraph had done its work. It had frozen the time advantage of the outlaws, while Logan and his men were struggling through the mud at 3 miles an hour. The news of their location had traveled instantly. The pursuit was not starting from behind, it was starting from the flanks. The railroad was using its technology to shrink the geography of the West, turning the vast distances that had once protected the outlaw into a trap. Sheriff Hazen rode out from Douglas with his men pushing hard to intercept the trail. He knew the country north of Wilcox. It was Teapot Creek country, broken badlands full of ravines and caves. It was defensive terrain, ideal for an ambush, but Hazen was not deterred. He had a duty to the county and a personal affront to settle. A robbery of this magnitude made the law look weak. He intended to prove otherwise. His posse was a mix of cowboys and deputies, men who could read sign in the mud and live out of a saddlebag for a week. They rode with a singular purpose, their eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale smoke of a camp or the glint of a rifle barrel. The atmosphere inside the special train as it clattered toward Medicine Bow was stifling with the smell of wet horses and tobacco smoke. The men sat in the sleeper car, cleaning their rifles, sharpening knives, and studying maps. They discussed the tactics of the wild bunch. They knew who they were dealing with. The sheer amount of dynamite used, the precision of the bridge blockade, it all pointed to the professional element of the hole-in-the-wall gang. This wasn't a crime of opportunity by drifting cowhands. This was organized crime, and to fight it, they had organized a mobile strike force. The train cut through the wind, the whistle screaming at every crossing, a mechanical shriek that echoed the electronic scream of the wires. By the afternoon of June 2nd, the net was tightening. The train arrived at Wilcox, unloading the horses and men directly onto the muddy right-of-way. The scene of the robbery was inspected with forensic coldness. The trackers looked at the hoofprints, leading north, They noted the depth of the impressions, the stride length. They estimated the weight of the loads. Heavy. The horses were carrying gold. This confirmed the telegraph reports. The outlaws were laden slow and leaving a trail a blind man could follow in the mud. The sheriff of Albany County met with the Union Pacific agents. They coordinated their movements. One group would follow the trail directly. Another would circle north to cut off the pass at the Powder River. The hunt was no longer a chase. It was a siege of the open range. The Wires had summoned a small army. The sheer scale of the reaction was something the outlaws might not have fully calculated. In the past, a posse took days to form. Now, thanks to the copper lines, the response was immediate. The telegraph had turned the robbery from a local event into a regional crisis within hours. The operators sat at their keys in Laramie, Rawlins, and Casper, waiting for the next signal, their fingers hovering over the brass, ready to relay the coordinates of a capture or a killing. As evening fell on June 2nd, the pursuit parties were in the field. The special train sat on a siding, steam up, ready to move support to wherever the telegraph dictated. The wires hummed in the cooling air, a constant invisible vibration of information. They carried orders for fresh horses, requests for more ammunition, and updates for the newspapers in the East. The robbery was already a headline in Chicago. The fame of the bandits was growing, but so was the desperation of their situation. They were three men against a corporation that spanned a continent, a corporation that could talk across hundreds of miles in a second. Sheriff Hazen camped that night near the swell of Teapot Creek, not far from where the outlaws had paused. He sat by his fire, listening to the night sounds. He didn't need a telegraph to know they were close. He could feel it. The mud was churned up where they had crossed. The grass was trampled. They were tired. He could see it in the sign. The Wires had done their part. They had delivered the hunters to the edge of the forest. Now it was up to the men and the rifles. The technology ended where the badlands began. The night of June 2nd bled into the morning of June 3rd. The telegraph offices stayed open 24 hours a day. The dispatchers drank coffee and watched the clock. The silence from the field was heavy. They knew that contact was inevitable. The outlaws had to stop eventually. They had to sleep, and when they did, the Wires would be waiting to scream the news of the end. The infrastructure of the West had mobilized to reject the virus of the outlaw. The poles, the wires, the tracks, and the engines, all of it was weaponized against Harvey Logan and his crew. The sun rose on June 3rd, illuminating a landscape that was crawling with armed men. The super posse was moving. The horses were fresh, the men were rested, and the information was, and the current. The Wires had done more than just report a crime. They had orchestrated a trap. The bandits were riding into a box, the walls of which were made not of stone but of information speed. The telegraph key clicked in the station at Casper. Posse closing in. Trail hot. Expect contact near Teapot Creek. The message flew down the line. A digital promise of violence in an analog world. The Wires didn't just scream, they hunted. The preparation of the pursuit train in Cheyenne had been a marvel of logistical fury. It was not merely a matter of coupling cars. It was the assembly of a war machine. The master of transportation, standing on the platform in his shirt sleeves despite the damp chill, barked orders at the yard crews. The horse palace cars, usually reserved for prize thoroughbreds, were commandeered for the posse's mounts. These cars were ventilated and stall-equipped, ensuring the animals would arrive at the drop point fresh and ready to run, not stiff and bruised from a rough ride in a common boxcar. The distinction was critical. In a long pursuit, the condition of the horse was often more decisive than the aim of the rider. The yardmen scattered sawdust on the floors of the cars to soak up the moisture and provide footing. They loaded bales of Timothy hay and sacks of oats, enough to sustain a cavalry troop for a week in the field. Inside the baggage car, which had been converted into a mobile armory, the special agents checked their weaponry. The standard Winchester lever-action rifles were present in abundance, their blued steel gleaming under the oil lamps. But there were also newer weapons, the Krag-Jurgensen bolt-action rifles, carrying the high-velocity 30-40 cartridge, capable of reaching out and touching a man at distances the older black powder guns could not hope to match. Cases of ammunition were pried open with crowbars, the brass cartridges spilling out onto tables where they were sorted into canvas bandoliers. The smell of gun oil and sawdust mixed with the pervasive scent of coal smoke. These men were not preparing for an arrest. They were preparing for a siege. They knew the reputation of the Wild Bunch. They knew that Harvey Logan would not be taken with a polite request and a pair of handcuffs. The telegraph operators at the main hub in Cheyenne became the nerve center of the operation. The room was filled with the clatter of a dozen keys, a chaotic symphony of information. Messages arrived from the farthest reaches of the division, from bridge watchers, section foremen, and town marshals, all reporting in. No sign at Carbon, no sign at Walcott, no sign at Hannibal. This negative intelligence was plotted on the large slate boards on the wall. It allowed the superintendents to visualize the invisible net. By process of elimination, they were drawing a circle around the bandits. The wires allowed the railroad to see the entire board at once, whereas the outlaws could only see as far as the next ridge. Sheriff Hazen, out in the field, represented the other half of the equation. While the railroad provided the technology and the logistics, Hazen provided the grit. He was a man who knew the texture of the Wyoming mud. He knew how a horse moved when it was tired, how a man rode when he was looking over his shoulder. He stopped his men frequently to dismount and examine the ground. He pointed out the deep indentations where the outlaws' horses had stumbled. He noted the spacing of the tracks. They were riding single file, stepping in each other's prints to mask their numbers. It was a classic trick, but it didn't fool Hazen. He could see the edges of the prints, the slight variations in the hoof sizes. He knew there were 3 of them. He knew they were heavy. And he knew they were heading for the jagged, broken country of the southern Bighorns. The weather, which had been the outlaws' ally during the robbery, was now turning against them. The sun of June 3rd was beginning to bake, the mud. The clay was turning from a soup into a hard, cracked surface. This was good for the horses of the posse, offering better footing, but it also meant the trail would become harder to read as the ground dried. Hazen pushed his men to move faster. He wanted to close the distance before the earth forgot the passage of the bandits. He rode a tall sorrel gelding, a horse with a long stride that ate up the miles. His deputies struggled to keep up, their mounts laboring in the heat that was rising from the damp ground. The psychological impact of the telegraph cannot be overstated. In the towns along the line, Rawlins, Medicine Bow, Rock River, the citizens gathered at the depots waiting for the bulletins to be posted on the chalkboards. The robbery was the only topic of conversation. The sheer audacity of blowing a train apart with dynamite captured the imagination, but the swiftness of the railroad's response awed them. They watched the special train rocket through their towns, not stopping, a blur of steam and intent. They saw the faces of the marshals in the windows. They knew that the era of the carefree bandit was ending. The machine was too fast, too strong, and too interconnected. Back on the special train, as it neared the drop point, the agents began to saddle their horses inside the moving cars. It was a delicate operation, cinching girths as the floor swayed beneath them. The animals were nervous, smelling the tension of the men. The train slowed as it approached the siding nearest to Teapot Creek. The steam whistle blew a long, mournful blast, signaling the arrival of the law. The ramp was lowered with a crash. The horses were led down, their iron shoes clattering on the wood. The men mounted up immediately, rifles pulled from scabbards, hats pulled low. They didn't wait for speeches. They turned their mounts toward the north and rode into the sagebrush, a column of armed retribution guided by the invisible hand of the telegraph dispatcher 300 miles away. The wires had done their job. They had screamed the alarm, woken the giant, and delivered the sword to the neck of the beast. Now the wires fell silent, waiting for the next signal, the signal that would confirm contact. The hunt was live. The data had become flesh and blood. The static of the telegraph key had transformed into the rhythmic thud of galloping hooves. June 3rd was no longer just a date on the calendar. It was the day the railroad proved that nowhere in the West was beyond the reach of its voice. June 4th, 1899. The dawn broke over the central Wyoming plains with a brilliant, hard clarity that burned the remaining mist off the sagebrush within an hour of sunrise. The storm system that had shielded the escape of the bandits for long hours had completely disintegrated, replaced by a high-pressure front that brought clear blue skies and a rapidly rising temperature. On a remote siding north of the Wilcox robbery site, the special train dispatched by the Union Pacific hissed and groaned as it sat stationary on the tracks, a massive iron beast breathing steam into the cool morning air. The heavy wooden ramp was lowered from the stock car with a resounding crash that echoed off the surrounding hills, signaling the beginning of the deployment. Inside the car, the horses stomped their hooves on the straw-covered floor, smelling the open air and the sage. Sheriff Joe Hazen stood at the bottom of the ramp, his boots planted firmly in the drying earth, watching the unloading process with a critical eye. Hazen was a man cut from the durable cloth of the frontier, the sheriff of Converse County, and a lawman who viewed his jurisdiction with a proprietary seriousness. He adjusted the brim of his hat against the morning glare. He wore a heavy canvas coat despite the warming day, the pockets filled with cartridges for his rifle. The weapon he carried was a tool of his trade, maintained with the same care a surgeon gave a scalpel. Around him, the other members of the posse were assembling. It was a formidable group, consisting of United States Marshal Frank Hadsell, Union, Pacific Detective Smoot, and expert trackers like Jeff Carr. The yardmen had scattered sawdust on the floors of the cars to soak up moisture, and now the horses descended the ramp, their iron shoes clanking on the wood before sinking into the soil. The men checked their cinches, tightening the girths against the bellies of the animals, and inspected their saddlebags to ensure they had water, jerky, and enough ammunition for a sustained firefight. The unloading was efficient and practiced, devoid of laughter or boasting. The mood was professional and cold. They were hunting men who had used enough dynamite to level a city block, men who would not surrender to a badge. The posse understood that they were riding toward a shooting war, not an arrest. Hazen mounted his horse, a tall sorrel with a white blaze on its face. The animal tossed its head, eager to move. The sheriff turned his attention to the ground. The heavy rain of the previous days had turned the prairie into a quagmire, but the sun and wind were beginning to bake the clay into a hard crust. The tracks of the outlaws were still visible, deep ruts cut into the earth where the heavily laden horses had struggled northward. Hazen rode out a few yards, leaning over his saddle horn to inspect the sign. He saw the distinct impressions of 3 riders moving single file. The depth of the hoofprints told the story. These horses were carrying excessive weight. Gold was heavy and fear was heavy. The posse formed a column and moved out, leaving the train and the railroad tracks behind. They headed north, following the trail that wound through the sagebrush flats toward the distant, jagged profile of the Casper Mountains. The pace was steady, a ground-eating trot that covered miles without burning out the mounts. Hazen rode at the point, his eyes scanning the horizon constantly. The landscape was deceptive. It looked flat from a distance, but it was riddled with dry washes, gullies, and ravines that could hide a regiment of cavalry. As the morning wore on, the heat began to rise. The moisture evaporating from the ground created a shimmering haze in the middle distance. The posse rode in silence, the only sounds being the rhythmic thudding of hooves, the creak of leather, and the jingle of bit chains. They crossed the drainage of a small creek, the water still running high and brown from the storm. Hazen noted the slide marks on the bank where the outlaws had forced their horses into the water and the broken branches of a willow thicket where they had pushed through. The journey of the posse was not merely a physical movement across geography. It was a psychological compression. As the miles fell away beneath the hooves of their horses, the world narrowed down to the singular purpose of the trail. The vastness of the Wyoming territory became a claustrophobic corridor defined by the tracks of the three fugitives. Sheriff Hazen felt this constriction. Detective Smoot rode alongside Hazen for a stretch, his newer model Winchester gleaming. He asked Hazen about the local geography and water sources. Hazen answered in monosyllables. He did not care for the railroad's bottom line or the corporate balance sheet. He cared about the violation of the peace in his county. The difference in their motivations was stark, but their goal was identical. They were united by the trail. By noon, they reached the foothills of the Laramie Range, where the terrain began to buckle and fold. The tracking became more difficult here. The ground was rockier, the soil thinner. The deep mud tracks gave way to scratches on sandstone and overturned pebbles. Jeff Carr moved to the front, dismounting occasionally to verify the path. The tracking process was a dialogue with the earth. Carr would stop, kneel by a track, and run his fingers lightly over the impression. He showed Hazen a scuff mark on a slab of rock, a white scar where an iron shoe had slipped, and a crushed sagebrush plant with leaves still wilting. These details painted a picture of the men they were chasing. They were tired. They were pushing too hard. They were making mistakes. The posse stopped briefly to water the horses at a spring, the men drinking from their canteens and wiping the dust from their faces. Hazen calculated the distance. If the posse kept this pace, they would cut the distance by half before sundown. They remounted and pushed on. The afternoon sun beat down on their shoulders. The smell of sage was overpowering in the heat. They rode through a section of ground known as the Burn, an area where a prairie fire had swept through the previous year. The blackened sagebrush stems tore at their clothes like charcoal fingers, leaving dark streaks on the canvas coats. The dust here was black and fine, rising in choking clouds that coated the inside of their noses and throats. They tied bandanas over their faces, looking like bandits themselves. The silence of the blackened landscape was eerie, devoid of birdsong or insect noise. As they moved out of the Burn and back into the red rock country, the geology became more aggressive. The wind had carved the sandstone into fantastic shapes that loomed over the trail. Shadows stretched and twisted, playing tricks on the eyes. A rock formation would look like a man crouching with a rifle, causing hearts to jump and hands to tighten on grips. Around 3 o'clock, they found the first campsite. It was a small box canyon where the outlaws had stopped to rest. The ashes of their fire were cold, but not ancient. Hazen knelt by the fire ring, stirring the charred wood with a stick. He found a discarded tin of beef, the metal jagged where it had been opened with a knife. He found the distinct imprint of heavy canvas bags pressed into the sand. The sensory details were sharp, the smell of the cold ash, the sight of the crushed grass where the men had slept. Hazen could see where one man had tossed and turned, the ground disturbed. He could see where another had sat keeping watch, a small pile of cigarette butts nearby. They were looking at the ghosts of the bandits. It made them real. These weren't just names in a telegraph message. They were men who smoked, who ate cheap beef, who got cold and tired. The discovery galvanized the posse. The fatigue of the ride fell away, replaced by the sharpness of the hunt. They tightened their cinches and mounted up with renewed urgency. The trail led out of the canyon and up a steep ridge. The posse followed, their horses scrabbling for purchase on the loose shale. When they crested the ridge, they looked out over the vast expanse of the Teapot Creek drainage. It was a rugged, broken country of deep ravines and high bluffs, a maze of erosion that offered 1,000 places to hide. Hazen signaled for the men to spread out slightly, moving in a skirmish line to sweep the ground ahead. The tracks led down into the basin, winding between the hoodoos and the washouts. The outlaws were using the terrain to mask their movement now, keeping to the low ground. The sun began to dip toward the western horizon, casting long purple shadows across the badlands. The light turned golden, illuminating the red earth with a fierce intensity. The heat of the day began to bleed away, replaced by the chill of the high desert evening. Hazen knew they would not catch them before dark. They made camp in a dry wash miles from anywhere. No fires were lit this night. A fire was a beacon in the dark, and they were too close to the enemy to risk it. The men ate cold rations, hard biscuits and dried meat. They spoke in whispers. Hadsell assigned guard duty, 2 men on the perimeter at all times. They fed the horses grain from the nosebags they carried. The animals were the priority. Without the horses, the posse was nothing. Hazen sat with his back against a sandstone wall, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. He cleaned his rifle by touch, running an oiled rag through the bore and wiping down the action. He thought about the men they were chasing, Harvey Logan, the Sundance Kid. These were not common horse thieves. They were professionals who had declared war on the society Hazen was sworn to protect. They had blown up a train and stolen a fortune. Hazen accepted the reality that they would not hesitate to kill a sheriff. He checked the load in his revolver, spinning the cylinder. 5 cartridges hammered down on an empty chamber. The night was quiet, save for the yipping of coyotes in the distance and the stamping of the horses. Hazen slept in shifts, his sleep light and shallow. Every snap of a twig brought him instantly awake. June 5th arrived with the same clarity as the day before. The posse was up before the sun, saddling horses in the gray pre-dawn light. They drank water and chewed on jerky, their eyes adjusting to the gloom. As soon as there was enough light to see the ground they were moving, the tracks were easy to pick up. The outlaws had moved north, following the creek bed. The morning of the 5th was tense. The terrain was forcing them into a funnel. The Teapot Creek bed was deep, with steep banks on either side. It was a natural highway, but also a trap. Hazen sent flankers up onto the rim of the canyon to prevent an ambush from above. The riders on the high ground moved slowly, silhouetted against the sky, while the main body of the posse moved along the creek bottom. The sign was very fresh now. They found a place where a horse had slipped and fallen. The ground churned up in a struggle. They found a discarded piece of leather strap cut from a saddlebag. The outlaws were shedding weight. They were pushing their mounts to the breaking point. Hazen urged his horse into a canter. The scent of the quarry was in the air. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, the tracker, Jeff Carr, held up a hand. The column halted instantly. Carr dismounted and examined a patch of mud near a stagnant pool of water. He waved Hazen forward. The sheriff rode up and looked down. The water in the hoofprint was still seeping in from the sides. The mud was wet on top of the dry crust. Someone had ridden through here less than an hour ago. Hazen looked up the canyon. The creek twisted and turned, obscured by willows and cottonwood trees. The outlaws were just ahead, perhaps around the next bend. He pulled his rifle from the scabbard, jacking a lever to chamber a round. The metallic clack-clack was loud in the silence. He signaled to the men. The time for tracking was over. The time for fighting had arrived. They advanced cautiously, weapons drawn. The valley narrowed. The walls of the ravine grew steeper. The willows grew thicker, pressing in on the trail. It was a perfect defensive position. Hazen knew it, but there was no other way. They had to push through. He took the lead, his eyes dissecting the shadows in the brush. The heat of the day was returning, sweat trickling down Hazen's back under his heavy coat. A fly buzzed around his horse's ear. The silence was heavy, pregnant with the threat of violence. They rode for another mile, the tension ratcheting tighter with every step. Then they saw it. A thin wisp of smoke rising from a cluster of rocks on the west bank of the creek. It was faint, almost invisible against the gray stone, but it was there, a campfire that hadn't been fully extinguished. Or a decoy. Hazen halted the line with a silent hand signal. He used field glasses to scan the area. He saw the shapes of horses tied deep in the brush. He saw movement. The outlaws had stopped. Hazen lowered the glasses. He turned to Hadsel and Smoot. He whispered his plan. They would split the force. One group would stay in the creek bed to hold their attention. The other group, led by Hazen, would circle around the ridge to come down on them from the flank. It was a classic pincer movement. The men dismounted, leaving a few deputies to hold the horses. They checked their weapons one last time. They tightened their bootlaces. They took deep breaths, steadying their nerves. This was the moment they had ridden for. The long train ride, the miles of tracking, the dust and the heat. It all came down to this patch of scrub brush and rock. Hazen led his group up the steep bank, moving quietly through the sagebrush. They crouched low, using the terrain to hide their approach. The rocks were sharp and hot to the touch. The air smelled of sage and impending gunfire. They moved into position, looking down into the outlaw camp. They could see figures moving now. Men in dusters, rifles leaning against rocks. The super posse had mobilized, tracked, and closed the distance. The wires had screamed, the train had rolled, and the men had ridden. Now the technology and the logistics faded away. It was just men with guns on opposite sides of a creek. Sheriff Joe Hazen looked down at the camp, his finger resting on the trigger of his rifle. He took a breath, ready to initiate the final phase of the pursuit. The hunt was over. The Battle of Teapot Creek was about to begin. June 5th, 1899. The silence that hung over the deep ravine of Teapot Creek was a deceptive, heavy stillness, masking the violent potential of the 20 men positioning themselves among the rocks and sagebrush. The sun was high overhead, a blinding white disk that bleached the color from the red sandstone walls of the canyon and baked the clay soil into a hard, cracked mosaic. Sheriff Joe Hazen lay flat on his stomach on the rim of the western ridge, the rough grit of the sandstone scraping against the canvas of his coat. He removed his hat, placing it slowly on the ground beside him to avoid breaking the silhouette of the skyline. Sweat trickled down his temple, cutting through the layer of gray dust that coated his face. Below him, 80 yards down the steep, brush-choked slope, the outlaw camp was a small, quiet circle of activity nestled against the cutbank of the creek. He could see the horses tied to a stand of willows, their tails swishing lazily against the flies. He could see the men, 3 distinct figures moving with a slow, tired economy. Hazen adjusted the sights of his rifle, sliding the rear leaf up a notch to compensate for the angle of depression. The weapon was hot to the touch, the steel barrel absorbing the intense solar radiation. He signaled to his deputy, a rancher named Lee, who was positioned 10 feet to his right. Lee nodded, his face pale and set in a grimace of tension. The plan was a coordinated strike. The main body of the posse, led by Marshal Hadsel, was moving up the creek bed from the south, using the noise of the rushing water to cover their approach. Hazen and his flankers were the hammer, poised to strike from above once the anvil was in place. The objective was to pin the bandits against the water and force a surrender. But looking down at the men below, seeing the rifles leaning within arm's reach of the bedrolls, Hazen knew surrender was an unlikely outcome. A sudden noise from the creek bottom shattered the stillness. A horse in the posse's lower group slipped on a wet stone, the iron shoe striking the rock with a sharp, resonant clatter that echoed off the canyon walls. In the camp below, the reaction was instantaneous. Harvey Logan whipped around, his hand blurring to the holster on his hip. The Sundance Kid dove behind a large boulder, dragging his rifle with him. George Curry scrambled for the cover of the depression where the horses were tied. The element of surprise had evaporated in a fraction of a second. Hazen shouted the order to fire. He squeezed the trigger of his rifle. The stock kicked against his shoulder, the report cracking through the dry air. His bullet kicked up a spray of dirt inches from where Logan stood, forcing the outlaw to roll into the cover of a fallen log. The ridge erupted in a ragged volley of gunfire. The deputies, adrenaline surging through their veins, fired rapidly, working the levers of their Winchesters. Smoke from the black powder cartridges puffed out in gray clouds, momentarily obscuring the view. Bullets shredded the leaves of the willows and chipped flakes of stone from the canyon floor. The noise was deafening, a chaotic roar that drowned out the wind and the water. The return fire from the creek bed was not the panicked spraying of amateurs. It was precise, rhythmic, and deadly. The outlaws were using smokeless powder ammunition, which gave them a distinct tactical advantage. There were no clouds of white smoke to mark their positions. Hazen saw a puff of dust erupt from the rock just inches from his face, stinging his cheek with rock splinters. The snap of the passing projectile was audible before the thud of the report reached him. He realized with a jolt of cold fear that they were taking aimed fire. He ducked lower, pressing his cheek into the dirt. Below, the battle had evolved into a stalemate of geometry. The outlaws were pinned in the low ground, but the low ground offered excellent cover. The creek bank was a natural trench, 4 feet deep, protected by the roots of the cottonwoods. From this entrenchment, they could sweep the ridge with fire without exposing more than the crown of a hat. Logan, using a high-powered rifle, was systematically targeting the muzzle flashes on the ridge. Every time a deputy raised his head to fire, a bullet snapped past, forcing him back down. The volume of fire from the outlaws was intense, suggesting they had ample ammunition and no intention of conserving it. Marshal Hadsel's group in the creek bed was pinned down as well. They had advanced to within 100 yards of the camp when the shooting started, but they were now trapped in a thicket of chokecherry bushes. If they moved forward, they walked into a kill zone. If they retreated, they exposed their backs. They fired blindly into the brush, hoping to suppress the bandits, but their shots were ineffective against the earthworks of the creek bank. The horses of the posse, terrified by the noise, were rearing and pulling at their reins, threatening to break loose and leave the men stranded. Hazen realized the situation was deteriorating. The high ground, usually an advantage, had become a trap. They were silhouetted against the bright sky while their targets were hidden in the dark shadows of the ravine. He needed to change the angle. He needed to get lower and closer to flank the outlaws' position behind the log. He signaled to Lee and another deputy, a man named Wheeler. He pointed to a cluster of sandstone boulders 50 yards down the slope, a position that would offer a clear line of sight into the outlaw trench. Hazen rose to a crouch, his rifle held across his chest. He moved fast, sliding down the scree slope, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. He reached the first rock and paused, breathing hard. The air tasted of sulfur and dry earth. He checked the position below. He could see the top of a hat moving behind the log. He moved again, darting across an open patch of ground toward the next cover. Down in the creek, Harvey Logan saw the movement on the slope. He tracked the figure of the sheriff through the sights of his rifle. He did not rush. He waited for the man to commit to the open ground. He exhaled slowly, steadying the barrel against the wood of the log. When Hazen broke cover for the final dash to the boulders, Logan squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck Hazen in the abdomen just below the ribs. The impact was not a sharp pain, but a massive, dull blow, as if he had been kicked by a mule. The force of the heavy slug spun him around and threw him onto his back in the loose shale. He gasped, the air driven from his lungs, his hands instinctively clutching at his stomach. A second shot kicked dirt into his face. He rolled frantically, scrambling behind the cover of a small rock, trailing blood across the gray stones. The shock of the wound was immediate. A cold numbness spread through his legs, followed quickly by a burning, tearing sensation in his gut. He looked at his hands. They were coated in bright red blood. He tried to call out to Lee, but his voice was a wet rasp. He coughed, and the taste of copper filled his mouth. He knew instantly that the wound was catastrophic. A gut shot in the middle of the Badlands was a death sentence, drawn out and agonizing. Deputy Lee saw the sheriff fall. He shouted a warning to the others. The fire from the ridge intensified, a desperate attempt to cover their fallen leader. Wheeler tried to run to Hazen's aid, but the ground around the sheriff was being churned up by a fresh volley of shots from the creek. The outlaws knew they had hit a man, and they were determined to finish him or prevent his rescue. Wheeler was forced to dive back behind cover, cursing helplessly as bullets whined off the rocks around him. The fight settled into a grim rhythm of attrition. The sun beat down on the wounded man. Hazen lay curled in the fetal position, the pain radiating out in waves that made his vision swim. The heat was unbearable. He was thirsty, a terrible parched thirst that made his tongue swell in his mouth. He reached for his canteen, but his fingers were weak and slippery with blood. He couldn't unscrew the cap. He let his hand fall, the canteen clattering against the stones. Below, the outlaws were shouting to each other. Their voices were calm, professional. They were discussing ammunition counts and sectors of fire. They were not panicked fugitives. They were soldiers in a defensive strongpoint. They had the water, they had the shade, and now they had the psychological advantage. They had drawn blood. Marshal Hadsell, hearing the shouts from the ridge that Hazen was down, tried to organize a rush. He ordered his men to fix bayonets, or the frontier equivalent, to draw revolvers and prepare to charge. But the terrain was against them. Between their position and the outlaws was 100 yards of open gravel bar. To cross it was suicide. They fired a heavy volley, hoping to suppress the bandits long enough for the flankers to move. But the outlaws simply ducked and waited for the lull. The afternoon dragged on, measured in the slow movement of the sun and the rhythmic cracking of rifles. Every time Hazen tried to move, to drag himself toward better cover, a fresh bullet would slap the ground near him. He was pinned, isolated in a zone of death only 30 yards from his men, but separated by a wall of fire. He drifted in and out of consciousness. He thought of his wife in Douglas. He thought of the election. He thought of the cool water of the North Platte River. The reality of the hot, dusty rock and the smell of his own blood kept pulling him back. The outlaws were pinning the posse down not to kill them all, but to buy time. They knew that darkness was their only escape. If they could hold the posse until sunset, they could slip away into the labyrinth of the Badlands. They fired steadily, conserving ammunition, targeting anyone who tried to organize a maneuver. Kid Curry moved from position to position in the creek bed, firing from different angles to make it seem like there were more men. He was a ghost, appearing, firing, and vanishing before the return fire could locate him. By 4 o'clock, the shadows in the canyon were lengthening. The heat began to break, but for Hazen, the cold was setting in. He was shivering violently, the blood loss sending his body into shock. His face was gray, his lips blue. Deputy Lee managed to crawl to a position where he could speak to the sheriff. He shouted that they would get him as soon as the sun went down. Hazen nodded weakly, closing his eyes. He gripped the rock beside him, his knuckles white. He was holding on by sheer force of will. The posse was frustrated and angry. They had the numbers, but they couldn't bring them to bear. The terrain funneled their movement, and the outlaws' superior position negated their firepower. Detective Smoot fired round after round into the creek bank, chipping away the earth, but he couldn't flush them out. The horses of the outlaws were well protected in the cut bank. The outlaws had planned this. They had chosen this spot not just for rest, but for defense. As the sun touched the western horizon, turning the sky a brilliant bloody orange, the volume of fire from the creek began to slacken. The outlaws were preparing to move. They checked their cinches in the fading light. They loaded fresh magazines. They knew the posse would try to rush them at dusk. Hadsell coordinated with the deputies on the ridge. On his signal, they would unleash a massive volley, pouring everything they had into the camp. Under that cover, Lee and Wheeler would dash out and grab Hazen. It was a desperate plan, but they couldn't leave him there another hour. The signal came. 20 rifles opened fire simultaneously. The noise was cataclysmic, a rolling thunder that echoed endlessly in the canyon. The creek bank exploded in dust and splinters. Under the canopy of flying metal, Lee broke cover. He ran low, sprinting the 50 yards to where Hazen lay. He grabbed the sheriff by the collar of his coat and dragged him backward, his boots scrabbling for purchase. Bullets whistled past them, but the suppression fire was working. The outlaws were keeping their heads down. Lee hauled Hazen behind the large boulder where the rest of the flankers were huddled. Hands reached out to pull them in. They tore open Hazen's shirt. The wound was ugly, a dark purple hole that was weeping blood. They pressed a compress against it, tying it tight with a belt. Hazen groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Lee and whispered a single word. Water. Lee held a canteen to the sheriff's lips. Hazen drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin, mixing with the dust and blood. It was a small mercy. But the men looking at the wound knew it was likely fatal. The bullet had traversed the intestines. In 1899, on the side of a dirt hill miles from a surgeon, that meant infection and death. The sun vanished and twilight descended rapidly on Teapot Creek. The shooting from the creek bottom stopped completely. The silence returned, more profound than before. Hadsell's men advanced cautiously, moving through the brush, expecting a trap. They reached the outlaw camp. It was empty. The bandits had slipped away in the confusion of the final volley. They had mounted their horses and ridden up the creek bed, using the soft sand to muffle their hoofbeats. They had left behind some discarded gear, a blanket, a coffee pot, a few empty cartridge boxes. But the money and the men were gone. They had held off a superior force for 6 hours, killed the leader of the pursuit, and vanished into the night. The posse regrouped at the creek. The mood was somber. They were exhausted, their ammunition depleted, their horses spent, and they had a dying man to transport. They fashioned a travois from 2 lodgepole, pine saplings, and a blanket. They lifted Hazen gently onto the stretcher. He was unconscious now, his breathing shallow and erratic. The journey out of the canyon was a nightmare of stumbling in the dark. The men took turns pulling the travois, navigating the rocks and the cactus. Every jolt elicited a groan from the sheriff. The deputies walked with their heads down, defeated. They had cornered the wild bunch, and they had lost. The blood trail at Teapot Creek was not just Hazen's, it was the blood of the law itself. The outlaws had proven that they were not just thieves, but combatants who could stand toe-to-toe with the authorities and win. The brutality of the situation, the gut shot, the pinned man, the heat, the thirst, solidified the gritty reality of the conflict. There was no glory here, just a man bleeding to death on a stretcher and 3 shadows riding north under the cover of darkness. They reached the waiting wagon miles down the trail near midnight. They loaded Hazen into the bed, packing straw around him to cushion the ride. The wagon set off for Douglas, the driver whipping the horses into a fast trot. But the men watching the taillights fade knew it was a race they wouldn't win. Sheriff Joe Hazen had fought his last battle. The remaining posse members stood in the darkness, listening to the wind in the sagebrush. They looked back toward the north, toward the hole in the wall. The trail was cold again. The bandits had escaped the net. The wires had screamed, the train had rolled, the posse had ridden, and in the end it had come down to a fraction of a second and a well-aimed bullet. The wild bunch was still free, and the price of the pursuit had been paid in full. The afternoon siege at Teapot Creek was a study in slow-motion violence. After the initial flurry of gunfire and the wounding of the sheriff, the engagement shifted from a battle of maneuver to a battle of nerves. June 6, 1899. The transition from the violent, noise-filled canyon of Teapot Creek to the silent, moonlit expanse of the open badlands was abrupt and disorienting, leaving the three riders suspended in a vacuum of exhaustion and adrenaline withdrawal. Harvey Logan, Harry Longabaugh, and George Curry rode north, putting the miles between themselves and the wounded sheriff with a grim, mechanical determination that bordered on a trance state. The adrenaline that had sustained them during the 6-hour firefight had evaporated completely, leaving behind a crushing fatigue that settled deep in their bones and made every movement a conscious effort of will. They did not speak to one another, for there was nothing left to say that the rhythm of the hooves could not articulate. The sound of the rifles was still ringing in their ears, a phantom echo that competed with the rhythmic thudding of the horses on the hard-packed clay, creating a dissonant soundtrack to their escape. They kept a steady pace, a fast trot that ate up the ground but punished the exhausted animals, knowing that the horses were the priority. If a mount failed here, in the middle of the empty quarter between the creek and the sanctuary, the rider was as good as dead. The night air was cool, a sharp and biting contrast to the baking heat of the afternoon siege, rushing past their faces and drying the sweat and dust into a mask of grime that cracked when they frowned. They rode single file, picking their way through the labyrinth of erosion that defined the landscape of the Powder River country. This was a broken, hostile terrain of deep ravines, sandstone pillars, and sagebrush flats that stretched endlessly into the dark. To the uninitiated, it was a maze without an exit, a place to die of thirst or exposure. To the men of the wild bunch, it was a backyard they knew by the shape of the skyline and the flow of the drainages. They navigated by the stars and the silhouette of the distant Bighorn Mountains, heading for a specific geologic anomaly that offered the only true safety remaining in the state of Wyoming. They rode for 3 hours without stopping, driven by the knowledge that the pause in the pursuit was temporary. The posse, demoralized by the loss of their leader and the coming of night, had broken off the immediate chase, but the outlaws knew the psychology of a manhunt better than anyone. When the hunter takes a bullet, the pack pauses to lick its wounds, but the anger that follows is colder and more persistent. This pause was their window, a narrow gap in the net that they had to drive their horses through before the sun rose and the telegraph wires mobilized a new, angrier wave of lawmen. The knowledge that they were now cop killers rode with them like a fourth passenger. Robbing a train was a crime against property, a financial transaction with a corporation. Killing a sheriff was a crime against the state, a personal affront to every badge in the West. The price on their heads had just doubled, and the possibility of surrender had been removed from the table forever. Around 2 in the morning, the terrain began to change as the flats gave way to rolling red hills, the soil turning a deep rusty color in the moonlight that signaled their approach to the Powder River. The river was the last major physical barrier before the hideout, a psychological boundary as much as a physical one. In June, fed by the snowmelt from the high country, the Powder was distinct from the dry washes they had crossed earlier. It was a wide, muddy, treacherous ribbon of water, known for its shifting quicksand and hidden currents that could swallow a horse whole. They could smell the water before they saw it. a scent of wet willow and mud that cut through the dry sage dust and signaled a brief respite for the thirsty animals. They reached the south bank and pulled the horses up, the animals standing with their heads low, sides heaving, foam lathering their necks where the reins had rubbed. The sound of the river was a low, rushing growl in the darkness, ominous and indifferent. Logan dismounted, his legs stiff and cramping as his boots hit the soft earth. He walked to the water's edge, testing the bank with his boot to ensure it wouldn't collapse. It was soft but firm enough to support weight. He scooped up a handful of water and splashed it on his face, washing away the grit of the gunfight, the cold shock momentarily reviving his senses. He drank from his cupped hands, the water tasting of silt and minerals before signaling the others that they would cross here. The crossing was a tense, dangerous operation that required absolute focus despite their exhaustion. The horses, smelling the water, wanted to stop and drink, but the men forced them into the current, knowing that a pause in the deep mud could be fatal. The river bottom was unpredictable, shifting daily with the flow. A horse could step into a hole and be swept away in seconds, dragging the rider and the gold with it. The weight of the gold and banknotes in the saddlebags acted as a heavy ballast, making the animals less buoyant and harder to maneuver against the flow. Curry went first, his horse plunging in until the water reached the stirrups, the current pushing hard against the animal's flank and forcing it downstream. Curry kept the reins loose, allowing the horse to find its footing, guiding it with his knees rather than the bit. He reached the far bank and scrambled up, the horse lunging for the solid ground. Longabaugh followed, then Logan, until they regrouped on the north bank, dripping wet, the cold water chilling them to the marrow but placing the river barrier firmly behind them. They pushed on immediately, the miles dragging as the night deepened into the pre-dawn hours. The moon set behind the mountains, leaving them in the profound darkness that precedes the morning. This was the hardest time to ride, the hour when the body demanded sleep with a physical ache. The mind played tricks in the gloom, turning bushes into crouching deputies and rocks into grizzly bears. Logan slapped his own face to stay awake, the sting helping to focus his eyes. He focused on the rhythm of the horse, step, 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 and on the money. The bags were still there, wet and heavy, a physical reminder of why they were suffering. They had carried the fortune through fire and water, through explosions and gunfights. They were not going to lose it now to a stumble in the dark or a moment of carelessness. The journey through the badlands between the Powder River and the Red Wall was a passage through a geological graveyard, a landscape composed of strata that had been twisted and tortured by ancient forces. The horses, sensing the exhaustion of their riders, moved with a stumbling gait, their heads bobbing low. Every step was a negotiation with the uneven ground, the iron shoes clattering against loose shale and sending cascades of stones rattling down into the darkness of the ravines. The sound was magnified in the silence of the night, causing the men to wince and scan the horizon for any sign of pursuit. But the desert was empty. The only witnesses to their flight were the owls that glided silently on the updrafts, and the coyotes that watched from the ridges with yellow eyes, indifferent to the plight of the fugitives. For Harvey Logan, the physical toll of the ride was manifesting as a dull, throbbing pain in his lower back and knees that grew sharper with every mile. The saddle, usually a place of comfort for a man who spent his life on horseback, had become a torture device of wood and leather. The seat was hard and unforgiving, and the constant friction of the wet denim against his skin had rubbed raw spots on his legs that burned with sweat. He shifted his weight constantly, trying to find a position that didn't hurt, but there was no relief to be found. The weight of the money bag behind him was a constant pressure, pushing him forward against the pommel. A golden burden he would not discard but hated in that moment. The darkness before dawn was absolute, the stars obscured by a high veil of cirrus clouds that had moved in after the storm cleared. This lack of light made navigation difficult, forcing them to rely on landmarks that were barely visible. A notched peak in the distance, a specific alignment of rock towers that only a local would recognize. They rode by feel, trusting the instincts of the horses to find the solid ground. The air grew colder as they gained elevation, a biting chill that seeped through their damp clothes and settled in the joints. They huddled into their coats, collars turned up, hats pulled down, the cold pressing down on them like a physical weight. As they neared the red wall, the scale of the formation became apparent even in the gloom, blocking out the lower stars with a massive black void that swallowed the horizon. The ground at the base of the wall was littered with massive boulders that had fallen from the face over the millennia, creating a debris field that forced them to slow to a crawl. Riding through this chaos was like riding through the ruins of a destroyed city. The horses picked their way carefully between house-sized rocks, their breathing loud and ragged in the stillness. The smell of the place was distinct, dry dust, sage, and the mineral scent of cold stone that had never seen the sun. The ascent up the scree slope to the entrance of the hole was the final physical test, a grueling climb that demanded the last reserves of strength from both man and beast. The angle of the trail was steep, nearly 45 degrees in places and covered in loose rock that shifted underfoot. The men dismounted, their boots sliding backward with every step, grabbing the reins near the bit to coax the animals upward. The horses lunged, their back legs digging in, their front hooves pawing at the shifting stone. The sound of their struggle was loud, the grunt of effort, the scramble of hooves, the clatter of rock. Sweat poured off the men, freezing instantly in the cold air, their hearts hammering against their ribs as they gasped for oxygen in the thin air. It was a desperate, clawing ascent toward sanctuary. When they finally crested the pass, the sun broke over the horizon behind them, hitting the top of the red wall and igniting it with light. The stone glowed with an impossible, vibrant orange-red luminosity that was a visual shock after hours of gray and black. The light spilled down the face of the cliff, chasing the shadows into the valley floor and revealing the hole in the wall in all its rugged glory. It was a wide, grassy valley protected by the vertical cliffs on the east and the rough slopes of the Bighorns on the west, a place that felt separated from the rest of the world. A lost continent where the rules of civilization did not apply. The descent into the valley was easier, but still required care as the trail switched back and forth down the steep slope. The horses, smelling the water and the grass below, tried to rush, and the men had to hold them back, checking their speed with the reins. They reached the valley floor where the Buffalo Creek meandered through a stand of cottonwood trees. The grass was tall and green, a stark contrast to the sagebrush flats of the badlands. The air was warmer here, protected from the wind by the high walls, and the sound of the creek was a gentle music that promised relief. They rode toward the cabin, the horses breaking into a tired lope as they sensed the end of the journey. The structure was built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud, with a sod roof that was overgrown with grass and weeds. It looked like it had grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. A corral made of pole fencing stood to the side, occupied by a few fresh horses that watched the new arrivals with curiosity. The smoke rising from the chimney meant warmth, coffee, and food, the most welcome sight they had seen in days. They rode into the yard of the cabin, and a man stepped out of the door holding a coffee cup, a rifle leaning against the doorframe. He watched them approach, not waving, just nodding a silent acknowledgement of their return. They pulled the horses up and dismounted. Logan's legs buckled as his boots hit the ground, and he grabbed the saddle horn to steady himself, feeling as if he had been riding for a century. He patted the neck of his horse, the animal trembling, its coat matted with dried sweat and river mud. It had given everything it had. The unloading of the horses was performed with the reverence of a ritual, They didn't just dump the gear, they stripped the animals down completely. They removed the bridles, rubbing the horses' ears where the leather had chafed. They removed the saddles, lifting the heavy leather trees off the sweating backs, steam rising from the horses in the cool morning air. They rubbed the animals down with handfuls of dry grass, removing the sweat marks and the mud, checking the hooves for stones. These animals had carried them to safety. They deserved to be tended to before the men tended to themselves. They carried the loot into the cabin, the interior dark and smelling of wood smoke, bacon grease, and old wool. They dropped the bags on the rough plank table in the center of the room, the sound of the gold hitting the wood a heavy, dull thud that signaled the end of the labor. Logan sat down on a bench, leaning his back against the log wall, pulling his hat off to run a hand through his dirty hair. He looked at the bags. $30,000. They had done it. They had robbed the Union Pacific, blown the safe, outran the telegraph, and outfought the posse. But the cost was in the room with them, in the exhaustion on their faces, the mud on their clothes, the bloodshot eyes. Curry opened one of the bags, pulling out a bundle of the unsigned idem banknotes. The paper was damp, but intact. He tossed it onto the table, then pulled out a sack of gold coins, untying the string and pouring the contents out. The gold double eagles spilled across the wood, gleaming in the light from the window. It was a pile of wealth that represented freedom, but right now, it just looked like metal. Longabaugh walked to the stove and poured a cup of coffee from the pot, drinking it black and boiling hot, wincing as it scalded his throat. He needed the pain to feel alive. He looked out the window at the red cliffs towering over the cabin. The wall was a comfort, a shield against the world, but it was also a prison wall. They could never really leave this life. They ate the biscuits and beans provided by the cabin's occupant with the voracious hunger of starving men, wiping the plates clean with the last crusts of bread. The food sat heavy in their stomachs, grounding them. The money bag sat on the table, a silent centerpiece. They would have to count it later, divide it, and figure out how to spend it without getting caught. But not now. Logan stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the valley. The sun was fully up now, bathing the red cliffs in a harsh, bright light. The sky was a piercing blue. It was a beautiful day in June. A hawk circled high above the canyon rim, riding the thermals. Logan watched it, feeling a strange kinship with the predator. He turned back into the room, walked to the bunk, and collapsed onto the mattress. He didn't take his boots off. He didn't take his gun belt off. He closed his eyes, and the image of the exploding express car flashed behind his eyelids. He heard the roar of the dynamite. He heard the crack of the rifles at Teapot Creek. He heard the scream of the sheriff. The hole in the wall was quiet. The wind whispered through the red rocks. The creek bubbled over the stones. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the sanctuary of the wild bunch. They were safe for today. Maybe for a week. Maybe for the winter. But the wires were still humming out on the plains. The special train was still steaming. The Pinkertons were still filing reports. The story of the Wilcox robbery was being written in newspapers from Cheyenne to New York. The raid was over. The chase was over. The posse had turned back. But the war between the Wild Bunch and the 20th century had just begun. Harvey Logan drifted into a dark, dreamless sleep, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver while the pile of gold coins on the table sat waiting to be spent, counted, or buried.